What happens when the woman who steps out of the carriage isn't the man he's been waiting for? Caleb Ashford has carefully arranged everything: an experienced wife, a mother to 2 children, a practical partner for his failing farm. But fate sends in a complete stranger, young, frightened, and carrying a secret she hasn't dared to confess. In a moment, all his plans crumble. Will he have the courage to see what his heart is deliberately ignoring? Watch to the end, hit like, and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late, which gave Caleb Ashford plenty of time to stand in the October wind and regret every decision that had led him to this moment. He stood at the edge of the depot platform with his hat pulled low and his jaw set in the way it always was when he was forcing himself to go through with something he didn't entirely want to do. The town of Harlow, Wyoming, stretched out behind him. A main street of storefronts, a handful of side roads that petered out into open prairie, and exactly the kind of silence that settled over a place once everyone who could leave had already gone. It was not an ugly town. It was simply an honest one, the kind that showed its wear without apology. He had dressed for the occasion. Clean shirt, coat he hadn't worn since the last funeral, boots that had seen a rag and a tin of wax that morning for the first time in months. He felt ridiculous in them, which was probably appropriate given what he was doing. Standing on a platform waiting for a woman he had never met, who was traveling across 4 states to become his wife, who had agreed to take on 2 children and a half-broken ranch, and a man who hadn't said more than 100 words a day since his wife died 14 months ago. The practical side of it made sense. That was what he had told himself. Behind him, leaning against the depot wall with his arms crossed and a look of studied neutrality on his face, stood his neighbor Roy Finch, who had agreed to drive the buckboard and had so far managed to say almost nothing, which was one of the things Caleb genuinely appreciated about him. "You doing all right?" Roy asked. "Fine. You look like a man heading to a hanging." "Appreciate that." Roy was quiet again. A dog crossed the street at the far end of town and disappeared between 2 buildings. Wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek bed. Caleb had left the children with Mrs. Dunnett, who ran the boarding house and had strong opinions about everything and had not kept any of them to herself when she heard about the arrangement. A mail-order bride, she had said, in the tone of a woman biting into something that had gone off. "Caleb, those agencies are full of desperate women and desperate situations." He had thanked her for her concern and left her with the children anyway, because she was good with them even if she thought he was making a serious mistake, and because at that point he had already paid the deposit to the agency and signed his name to enough paperwork that backing out would have cost him money he didn't have. 14 months since Clara died. 14 months of burned porridge and missed school days and watching his daughter Lily cry quietly into her pillow at night because she thought he couldn't hear her through the wall. 14 months of his son Ben going stiff and blank-faced whenever anyone at school asked about his mother, and coming home and throwing rocks at fence posts until his arm gave out. Caleb had tried. He had done his honest best by them. But he was a man who had spent his life learning how to work land and fix things that broke with his hands, and grief didn't work like that, and children needed things he did not know how to give. The agency had sent a profile. Margaret Holloway, widow, 41 years old, experience running a household, 2 grown children of her own in Philadelphia, looking to establish herself in the West. The letter had been direct and sensible, and had said nothing about romantic notions. That suited Caleb perfectly. He was not looking for romance. He was looking for help. For someone who understood what this was, a practical arrangement between 2 adults who needed something from each other, and who wouldn't arrive expecting things he couldn't provide. He had written back. She had written back. 3 letters in total, none of them long, all of them businesslike. He had liked that about her. The sound of the stagecoach came before it appeared, the knock and rattle of wheels on the rutted road, the percussion of hooves, the driver calling out to settle the horses as they pulled into the depot. Caleb straightened up and put his hands in his coat pockets so they had something to do. The coach door swung open. A man got out first, traveling salesman by the look of him, sample case in hand, already scanning the street for a hotel. Then an older couple, moving slowly, the woman holding the man's arm. Then a pause, long enough that Caleb thought that was everyone. Then she stepped down. She was not Margaret Holloway. He knew that immediately, the same way you know when something is wrong before you can name the specific thing. some internal reckoning that precedes understanding. Margaret Holloway was 41, the woman standing on the platform looking back at him with enormous dark eyes and a face that barely knew its third decade was not 41 years old by any reasonable measure. She was slight, with dark hair pinned up under a traveling hat, dressed in clothes that had once been good quality and had been carefully maintained past the point where careful maintenance could do much more for them. She held a single bag in both hands, and there was a white-knuckled quality to her grip that she was clearly trying to disguise. She looked at him. He looked at her. The salesman and the older couple had moved off into town. Roy had gone very still against the wall. "Mr. Ashford?" she said. Her voice was steadier than her hands. "Yes." A pause. The wind moved between them. She seemed to be working up to something, bracing herself against the saying of it. "My name is Naomi Quinn," she said. "I was sent by the Whitmore agency. I know I'm not who you were expecting. I know that, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She stopped, swallowed once. "Mrs. Holloway, she took ill 3 weeks ago. Seriously ill. She couldn't travel. The agency was trying to find a replacement, and there wasn't much time, and I was available, so they sent me in her place. They should have written to you sooner. They should have given you the choice. I told them that." She met his eyes directly, which cost her something. He could see it. "I'm sorry. You deserved better than this." Caleb stood very still. He could feel Roy watching him from the wall. He could feel the driver up on the box seat doing something with the harness that required great concentration. He could feel the particular quality of a public moment, the way it had edges. "The agency sent a replacement," he said, "without notifying me." "Yes." "And you agreed to this?" The slight hesitation. "I agreed to try. I understood it was your decision to make." Something moved behind his eyes that he kept off his face. The agency. He had paid the agency $60, which was money he had needed for other things because they had assured him they vetted their candidates and handled every detail professionally. He had believed them because he hadn't had the luxury of not believing them, because there had not been another plan. "How old are you?" he asked. She held herself a little straighter. 24. Mrs. Holloway was 41. Experienced. She'd run a household, raised children. "I know. What experience do you have?" Something moved across her face, briefly, and then it was gone, smoothed over by whatever composure she had come here with. "I can cook, I can clean, and I can manage a household budget, and I learned quickly. I know that's not the same as what you arranged for. I'm not telling you it is." "No," he said, "it is not." Roy cleared his throat softly against the wall. Caleb ignored him. He looked at Naomi Quinn standing on the platform of the Harlow Depot with her second-hand traveling clothes and her single bag and her careful, deliberate steadiness. And he felt something that was mostly anger, and underneath the anger, something he didn't examine too closely, because he had learned in the past 14 months that examining things too closely in unguarded moments led nowhere useful. "The coach goes back east in 2 days," he said. "I'll arrange for a room at the boarding house while I contact the agency. We'll sort out getting you home." She didn't flinch exactly, but something changed in the set of her shoulders, a barely perceptible settling, like a person absorbing a blow they had already known was coming. "All right," she said. "That's your right." He reached for her bag, because whatever else he had been raised with manners, and she let him take it, and they walked in uncomfortable silence toward the buckboard, where Roy was doing an admirable job of looking like he hadn't heard any of it. Mrs. Dunnett's boarding house was a 2-story frame building on the east side of Harlow's main street, with a porch that needed painting and curtains in every window, and the permanent smell of coffee and something baking that Caleb had always found faintly oppressive. He left Naomi in the parlor with Roy's awkward offer of coffee and went to find Mrs. Dunnett, who was in the kitchen and turned from the stove with the expression of someone who had already been told everything worth knowing. "She's young," Caleb said. "I can see that from here. The agency substituted her without telling me. The original woman took ill." Mrs. Dunnett turned back to the stove with the particular economy of motion that meant she had opinions she was organizing. "Shame about the other one. Is she staying?" 2 days, until the coach goes back." A pause. "She seems frightened." "She's in a stranger's town waiting to be sent home. I expect most people would be." I expect most people wouldn't have come in the first place. She set a lid on a pot with a precise click. That took some nerve, Caleb, coming all this way knowing what she was walking into. He didn't answer that. He went back to the parlor. Naomi was sitting in the chair nearest the window, her bag on the floor beside her, her hands folded in her lap. She had taken her hat off, which made her look somehow younger and also somehow more herself. The careful formality of the traveling clothes dropped one small degree, just enough to be visible. She wasn't looking at anything in particular. She had the look of a person thinking through something complicated and not entirely succeeding. She straightened when he came in. "Mrs. Dunnett will show you to a room," he said. "Meals are included. I'll send word to the agency tonight." "Thank you." A pause. "Mr. Ashford." "Caleb." She seemed briefly uncertain about the name, then accepted it. "Caleb, I am genuinely sorry for the way this was handled. I wanted to write to you directly, before I left, to give you the chance to refuse. The agency said there wasn't time. I don't know if that was true or if it was convenient for them." She looked at him steadily. "I think you deserved the choice." He studied her for a moment. 24 years old, alone, sitting in a strange town in Wyoming waiting to be turned back around. He noticed, not for the first time, that she was not asking for anything, not pleading, not attempting to negotiate. She had said her piece and she was letting it sit. "It wasn't your decision to make," he said. "It was the agency's failure." "Yes," she said, "but I was part of it." He left before he could think too long about that. His ranch was 6 miles outside of Harlow, and the drive back along the river road in the late afternoon was one of those painful autumnal things that Wyoming did sometimes. The light going gold through the cottonwood leaves, the mountains going blue and sharp against the sky, everything beautiful and indifferent in the way that open land was always beautiful and indifferent. Roy drove without talking, which was a mercy. The children were still at the boarding house. Mrs. Dunnett had agreed to keep them through supper, given the circumstances. And so the ranch was quiet when Caleb got back. He went through the barn, checked the stock, did the things that needed doing, and tried not to think about the $60 and the paperwork and the way the agency had taken his money and sent him a 24-year-old girl with no experience and a single bag. He tried not to think about what she had said. "I wanted to give you the choice." He went inside and started a fire and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house had a way of talking to him since Clara died. Not in any mystical sense. He was not a man given to mystical thinking, but in the way that empty places hold the shape of what they used to contain. The chair where Clara had sat to mend things. The hook by the door where her coat had hung for 7 years. The smell of the kitchen, which had been wrong for 14 months in a way he couldn't name and wasn't sure he wanted to. He had contacted the agency in August. He had not told his children until September, and even then only because Ben had overheard him on the telephone at the post office and had come home with a set jaw and a burning kind of look in his eyes that Caleb recognized because he saw it in the mirror. "Are you replacing Ma?" "No, I'm trying to hold this family together." Ben had gone to his room and not come out for supper. Lily, who was 8 and felt things at a register that made Caleb simultaneously grateful and helpless, had cried for an hour and then crawled into his lap and said she was sorry, and he had held her and not said anything because there was nothing right to say. He had told them the bride would arrive on the Tuesday stage. He had not told them she didn't. He would have to tell them tomorrow. He collected them from Mrs. Dunnett's after breakfast the next morning. Mrs. Dunnett had fed them pancakes and told them nothing, which was either professional discretion or the recognition that it wasn't her story to deliver. Lily was cheerful, which was her natural state when someone had recently given her pancakes. Ben was 11 and had recently decided that cheerful was a form of weakness and maintained a studied composure that would have been almost funny if Caleb hadn't understood exactly where it came from. They drove home along the river road. "Was she on the stage?" Lily asked. She was sitting between them on the buckboard seat, her boots swinging. "There was a woman on the stage," Caleb said carefully. "Is she here? Is she at the ranch?" "She's in town." Ben looked at him from the other side of Lily. 11 years old and already reading silences the way men twice his age did. "What happened?" "The woman I was expecting couldn't make the trip. She took ill. The agency sent someone else." A pause. The horses moved along the rutted road. "Someone else," Ben repeated. A woman named Naomi Quinn. And she's in town, Ben said. Not a question. For now. Lily had gone very still. Is she going home? I haven't decided anything yet. Which was not entirely true, but was more honest than the alternative. Another silence. Lily looked at her boots. Ben looked at the road ahead with that set expression that Caleb had stopped knowing how to read. You should at least meet her, Ben said finally, in a tone that was deliberately neutral, and therefore not neutral at all. I'll handle it, Ben. I know you will. A beat. I'm just saying. Lily didn't say anything. She reached over and put her hand through Caleb's arm and held on, and he let her, and they drove the rest of the way home without talking about it again. He went back to town that afternoon. He told himself it was to send the letter to the agency. He did send the letter, but he also walked past the boarding house twice before he went in, which told him something he would rather not have known about himself. Naomi was in the small sitting room off the parlor, working. She had found, or Mrs. Dunnett had given her, a pile of mending, and she was working through it with a focused efficiency that was somehow startling in someone who was only here for 2 days, like she didn't know how to be idle or couldn't afford to be. She looked up when he came in. I sent the letter, he said. All right. She set down the mending. Thank you for letting me know. He stood in the doorway, which was not the position of a man who had come to say one thing and leave. She seemed to recognize this and waited. What brought you to this? He asked. The agency. She was quiet for a moment. The honest kind of quiet, not the evasive kind. I was living in Harrisburg, she said. I'd been working in a hat shop for 2 years after a situation that left me without much. The shop was closing. I didn't have family to go back to. I had some money saved, not a lot, and the agency advertised in a women's magazine I read sometimes. She paused. It wasn't what I planned for my life. I want to be honest with you about that. But not many things have gone the way I planned. What was the situation? The one that left you without much? The hesitation was brief. I was engaged. He changed his mind. And in the process of changing it, some things became complicated. Financially. He didn't push on that. Are you frightened? He asked instead. She looked at him steadily. Yes. Not of you. Of being sent back to nothing. A pause. That sounds like I'm making an argument for keeping me. I'm not. I'm just answering your question. I know you are. He sat down in the chair across from her, which surprised them both, he thought. Tell me honestly, he said, what you know how to do. Not what you want me to believe you know how to do. What you actually know. She studied him for a moment, as if recalibrating. I can cook from scratch, she said. Not fancy. I don't know much that's fancy, but solid meals and I don't waste things. I can manage a kitchen and a household budget, and I'm careful with money because I've had to be. I can sew, I can clean, I can do laundry, I can deal with suppliers and keep accounts. I'm good with numbers. A pause. I don't know ranching. I know nothing about cattle or horses beyond how to not startle one. I wouldn't pretend to. My children, he said. What do you know about children? Not as much as Mrs. Holloway would have. I don't have my own. Another pause. I was the eldest of 5. I helped raise my brothers and sisters. I know that children aren't little adults, and I know they need stability, and I know that grief does strange things to young people because I watched it do strange things to my youngest brother after our father died. She held his gaze. That's all I can tell you. He sat with that for a moment. The ranch is struggling, he said. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. We had a bad summer, cattle prices dropped, and there's a note at the bank that I'm managing, but only just. I can't pay you a salary. I can give you a home and a fair life, but I can't promise you prosperity. I didn't come looking for prosperity. What did you come looking for? She was quiet again. A real pause, the kind where the person was actually thinking and not just performing thought. Somewhere that needed me, she said finally. Somewhere I wasn't extra. Caleb didn't respond to that. He sat with it, the way you sat with something that had more truth in it than was comfortable to look at directly. He had his own version of that feeling, after all. The particular weight of a man who had spent 14 months being needed by 2 children in ways he wasn't sure he was equipped to meet. He stood up. I'll come by tomorrow morning, he said. Early. My children will be with me. No promises. But I think you should meet them. Something shifted in her face. Not relief exactly. Too careful for that. But something. Thank you, she said. He left without letting himself examine why he had said it. Morning came the way mornings did in October. Gray and cold at the edges, the kind of light that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Caleb had the children dressed and the buckboard hitched before 7, which prompted Ben to observe that it was early and Lily to ask 5 times if she could sit in the front. You always sit in the front, Ben said. I'm asking if it's okay. You always ask if it's okay, and then you sit in the front. That's because it's always okay. Ben looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who had already lost this argument and knew it. Caleb didn't comment. He climbed up, Lily inserted herself between them, and they went. The boarding house was quiet at 7 in the morning. Mrs. Dunnett answered the door in her apron and said Naomi was already up, which she delivered with the tone of a woman revising an opinion. Naomi was in the kitchen, helping with the breakfast dishes. She was still in her everyday clothes. The traveling outfit had been replaced with something simpler, a gray dress that had also seen some years. And her hair was loose at the edges in the way it got when you'd been working with your hands. She turned from the sink when they came in. Lily, who had been constructing some elaborate social strategy in her head for the past 6 miles, abandoned it completely and said, Your hair's pretty. Naomi blinked. Thank you. Mine gets all knotted. Pa doesn't know how to do it right. Lily, Caleb said. It's true. She looked up at Naomi with the forthright directness of an 8-year-old who hadn't yet learned to be strategic about sincerity. Are you going to stay? I don't know yet, Naomi said honestly. That depends on your father. He says he hasn't decided. I know. Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, Would you want to? Stay, I mean, if it was up to you. A pause. Naomi looked at the girl for a moment. Yes, she said. I think I would. Ben, who had stayed in the doorway and crossed his arms and done everything short of wearing a sign that said, I am reserving judgment, watched this exchange without expression. But when Naomi looked at him, just looked, didn't smile too wide or say something trying to be friendly, and said simply, You must be Ben. He uncrossed his arms. Yeah, he said. Your father says you help run the ranch. A beat, the faintest shift in the set of his jaw. Not quite pride, but adjacent to it. Some of it. I'd like to hear about that sometime. I don't know anything about ranching. Nothing? Nothing useful. He looked at her for a moment, and Caleb, watching from across the kitchen, could see the boy recalculating. Ben did not like to be managed. He had an 11-year-old's radar for adults who were being nice to him because they wanted something. But Naomi had said it the way you said a fact, without any performance of warmth, and that was the language Ben recognized. It's not that complicated, Ben said, once you know it. I'm sure, Naomi said. Everything usually isn't. Wasum. They spent 2 hours at the boarding house. Naomi made coffee and helped Mrs. Dunnett with the mid-morning cleaning and talked to the children with a naturalness that Caleb couldn't fully account for. Not the performed ease of someone trying to be liked, but the actual ease of someone who was simply present. Lily followed her from room to room. Ben circled at a distance that gradually became a shorter distance. Caleb watched. He was watching, specifically, for the thing that would confirm his instinct to send her home. The thing that would make the decision clean and clear. He had gotten good in the past year at protecting himself from things that weren't clean and clear, at keeping the borders of his life manageable, because manageable was the difference between keeping this family afloat and going under. He didn't find the thing. What he found instead was his daughter sitting on the floor of the parlor with a woman she had met that morning, showing her a drawing she had done of a horse that looked mostly like a horse, and Naomi studying it with genuine attention and saying, You've got the legs right. That's the hardest part. And Lily flushing with the particular pleasure of a child who has been taken seriously by an adult. He found his son, later, explaining the mechanics of a water pump in the backyard to Naomi, with the patient condescension of someone who knows a great deal and doesn't often get asked. And Naomi listening without interrupting, asking one question that turned out to be exactly the right question, and Ben's face doing that thing it did when he didn't want to be pleased about something but was. He found himself standing in Mrs. Dunnett's kitchen doorway. Thinking about $60 and bad summers, and a note at the bank, and 2 children, and an empty house. Thinking about somewhere that needed me. He was still standing there when the sound changed. It happened in the back hallway, a sharp crack, high-pitched, and then Lily's voice, which started with a word and became a cry before the word finished. Caleb moved without thinking, down the hall and around the corner, where Lily was on the floor with her hand pressed to her knee and blood on her palm and her face scrunched against tears she was fighting. She had caught the edge of the wood box, a splinter, long and mean, driven into the soft skin below her kneecap. She was 8 years old and she was trying very hard not to cry in front of anyone, which made it worse, the trying. Naomi was already there, not in a rushing, fluttering way. She had simply moved, and now she was on the floor beside Lily, not towering over her the way adults did when they were trying to help, but down at her level. "Let me see," she said. Lily, who had been holding herself rigid against the pain, released something. Some held breath, some braced against the world, and let Naomi take her hand. "That's a good-sized one," Naomi said, examining the splinter with matter-of-fact calm, the way a person talks about a problem that is real but solvable. "Does it hurt all the way up to here?" She touched a point above the knee gently, and Lily shook her head. "Good. That means it's just in one place. I'm going to need a needle and some clean cloth." She looked up at Caleb, who was in the doorway. Something passed between them, not anything he could have named, and he went to find Mrs. Dunnett. He came back with the needle and cloth in 2 minutes. By the time he returned, Lily had stopped fighting the tears and had actually cried some of them, leaned against Naomi's shoulder, and was now in the relieved, slightly embarrassed state that comes after. Naomi was talking to her quietly. Something about a time she'd gotten a splinter from an apple crate that had been 3 times the size, which was probably not true but was told with enough detail to be interesting. Lily noticed Caleb in the doorway. "She's going to get it out," she said, with the grave confidence of someone who has authorized a medical procedure. "I can see that," he said. He watched Naomi work. Careful, efficient, not making more of it than it was, not less. Talking to Lily the whole time in a steady voice that gave the girl somewhere to put her attention that was not the needle. When it came free, Lily made a sound that was half pain and half relief, and Naomi held the wound with the clean cloth and said, "There, worst part's done." "Did you get it all?" "Every bit." Lily examined her knee with critical interest. "Will it scar?" "Probably not. Maybe a little." "I don't mind a scar," Lily said. "Ben has too." "That's true," Ben said from behind Caleb. He had been there long enough to have watched most of it. One from a fence post and one from a stupid bet. "The bet was not stupid," Naomi said, without looking up from tying off the cloth. "It just didn't go the way you hoped." Ben stared at her. "I didn't tell you about any bet." "No," she agreed. "But you mentioned the scar like you were a little proud of it, so I assumed." A pause. Ben's mouth did something it almost didn't do, something that was almost a smile, and then retreated. "It was a dumb bet," he admitted. "I still say it wasn't." Lily beamed. Caleb stood in the doorway of the boarding house hallway in his good coat and his waxed boots and watched the woman he had come here to send home press a clean cloth to his daughter's knee with hands that did not shake. He thought about the empty house, about the chair where Claire had sat, about a note at the bank and a bad summer and 2 children who needed things he did not know how to give. He thought about 24 years old and a single bag and somewhere that needed me. He thought about the way Lily had leaned. He didn't say anything then. He didn't have words for it, and he was suspicious of words anyway. But something shifted in him, the way things shifted in structures under load. Not a breaking, not a giving way, but a settling, a redistribution of weight. He would sleep on it. He was a man who slept on things. But the decision, when it came, he already knew, somewhere below the careful logic he'd built his life on. The decision was not going to be the one he'd arrived at that depot expecting to make. He drove home with his children in the long afternoon light, the mountains going copper against a sky that couldn't decide if it was done with the day. Lily sat between them again with her wrapped knee and an expression of deep satisfaction. Ben was quiet in the particular way he got when he had processed something and was still organizing where it fit. After a while, Ben said, "She's not what you asked for." "No," Caleb agreed. "She's not what Ma was either." "No one is." A pause. "That's not what this is." Ben looked at the road. I know. Another pause. Longer. I think she'd be good at it. If you let her. Caleb didn't answer. Lily, who had been listening to all of this with the patient attention of someone who already knew what she thought, said, Are you going to let her? The horses moved along the road. The cottonwoods threw long shadows across the ruts. I'm thinking about it, Caleb said. Lily looked up at him with 8-year-old precision. You already decided, she said. You always say you're thinking about it when you've already decided. He looked down at her. She looked back up at him with Clara's eyes, which she had, exactly, and had no idea what they cost him sometimes. Maybe, he said. She smiled, settled back against his arm, and looked at the road ahead like a person who had already planned the next part of the story. He told her the next morning. He drove back into Harlow before 8 o'clock, before the town had fully committed to the day, and found her in Mrs. Dunnett's kitchen again. Apparently that was where she defaulted when she didn't know what else to do with herself, peeling potatoes with the focused efficiency of someone who needed her hands occupied. She looked up when he came in and read something in his face before he said a word, because he was beginning to understand, the kind of person who paid close attention. 30 days, he said. That's what I'm offering. You stay, you do the work, you get to know the children and the ranch, and at the end of 30 days, we decide together whether this continues. I'm not making any promises beyond that. She set down the potato. What changed your mind? He had expected her to say yes immediately, or to ask about terms, or to look relieved. The question caught him slightly off balance, which he suspected was not accidental. Yesterday, he said, what you did for Lily. That wasn't anything. That was a splinter. I know what it was. He looked at her steadily. It was the way you did it. You didn't make a production of it. You just did it. He stopped because he was already saying more than he'd intended, and he had a 30-year habit of not saying more than he intended. 30 days, fair trial, fair assessment. If it doesn't work, I'll pay your fare home myself. Naomi wiped her hands on the dish towel and looked at him with those careful dark eyes. And the marriage? That's a question for the end of 30 days. She nodded slowly, as if she were running calculations he couldn't see. I have one condition, she said. He hadn't expected that either. Go ahead. If I do something wrong, if I make a mistake, if I fall short of something you need, you tell me directly. Don't store it up. Don't decide quietly that it's not working and wait until the 30 days are up to say so. She held his gaze. I'd rather know when I've missed something. I can't fix what I don't know about. He studied her for a moment. Agreed, he said. Same goes in reverse. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. All right, she said. Then, yes. She picked up the potato and went back to peeling, which he appreciated. No tearful gratitude, no dramatic moment, just yes, and back to work. He drove her out to the ranch that same afternoon, her single bag in the back of the buckboard, and Mrs. Dunnett watching from the porch with an expression that had moved over the course of 2 days from concern to something more like cautious interest. The ranch was called the Ashford Place, which was what everyone in the county called it, and what it had been called for 12 years since Caleb's father had deeded it to him. It sat on a bend of the Powder River tributary, 40 acres of working land, and another 80 that were grazing range, with a house that had been built in stages as money allowed and showed it. The original 2 rooms still solid, the additions a little rougher, a little more provisional. The barn was good. The corral needed a post replaced on the north side. The kitchen garden had gone to seed in late summer and nobody had cleared it. Naomi looked at all of it as they drove in and said nothing, which he respected. The children were home from school. Lily came out of the barn where she'd been bothering the barn cat and stopped in the yard when she saw the buckboard, and her face went through 3 or 4 rapid changes before settling on something that was mostly happiness with a thread of uncertainty running through it. Ben came out behind her and stood with his hands in his pockets, and his face was one thing only, which was careful. She staying? Lily said. 30 days, Caleb said. Trial basis. What does that mean? It means we're all figuring it out, Naomi said from beside him. She climbed down from the buckboard without waiting for help. Not out of pride, he thought, but because it simply hadn't occurred to her to wait, and landed in the yard and looked at the children directly. I'm going to need someone to show me where things are, inside and out. I don't like not knowing where things are. Lily immediately raised her hand like she was in school. I'll show you the kitchen, she said. Ben knows the barn, but I know the kitchen better. That's not completely true, Ben said. Name one thing in the kitchen. A pause. The big pot. Where is it? Another pause, slightly longer. In the kitchen. Show me where in the kitchen. He uncrossed his arms. I'll show you the barn, he told Naomi. She looked at him with something that was almost amusement. Thank you, Ben. He picked up her bag before she could and carried it inside, which Caleb watched with the particular feeling of a man who has predicted something and is not sure whether to be relieved or unsettled that he was right. The first week was not smooth. He had not expected it to be. Naomi moved through the house like someone learning a language by immersion, making mistakes, catching herself, adjusting. She burned the first batch of biscuits because the oven ran hot and nobody had told her, and she scraped the pan and made a second batch without comment, and the second batch was fine. She reorganized the pantry on the third day, not by making a project of it, but apparently because the previous system bothered her on some fundamental level. And when Caleb came in to find things moved, he said, "Where's the salt?" And she said, "Second shelf, left side, next to the flour." And it was, and it turned out that was a better place for it. She did not try to do everything at once. That was the thing he noticed first, that she seemed to understand the difference between what needed doing immediately and what could wait, and she worked in the order things actually mattered rather than the order that would make the most visible impression. The kitchen was functional before it was clean. The meals were consistent before they were interesting. She was building something from the ground up in the order a structure required. Caleb watched all of this from a careful distance, which was where he did most of his watching. The children were another matter. Lily had decided within 48 hours that Naomi was the most interesting person she had encountered in recent memory, a position she held with an 8-year-old's total commitment. She followed Naomi through the house asking questions about everything: where she was from, what Harrisburg was like, how she learned to cook, whether she had ever seen the ocean, what her favorite color was. Did she like horses? Had she ever been on a train? Naomi answered all of it with patience that didn't feel performed, and asked questions back, and Lily expanded in the particular way children did when an adult was genuinely listening to them. Ben was more complicated. He was 11, and he was Clara's son in more ways than his eyes. He had her habit of watching from the edges before he committed himself, her instinct to test rather than trust, her stubborn streak that ran bone deep and had been both her greatest asset and occasionally her greatest difficulty. He was polite to Naomi, which was different from being warm, and careful, which was different from being open. He helped when asked and offered nothing beyond what was asked, and watched her the way someone watched a fence they weren't sure would hold. Naomi seemed to understand this, or at least to leave it alone, which was probably the right approach. On the fourth day, she asked Caleb what Ben was good at. They were in the kitchen after supper, Caleb at the table with the ranch accounts, the relentless arithmetic of a bad year, and Naomi at the sink with the dishes. The children were in bed. The lamp made a small pool of yellow light, and the wind was going at the windows the way it did in October. At what? Caleb said. In general. What does he care about? What does he do well? Caleb set down his pencil. He thought about it the way he actually thought about it, not the quick parental summary. Mechanics, he said finally. Anything with moving parts. He rebuilt a hand pump last spring that I'd been putting off for a year. Figured out what was wrong himself, ordered the part, fixed it. He was 10. A pause. He reads. More than you'd think for a boy who acts like he doesn't. He hides the books. Naomi was quiet, drying a plate. He misses her, Caleb said, because it seemed to need saying. He doesn't show it the way Lily does, but it's in everything he does. The way he's careful about things. The way he doesn't like surprises. He picked up his pencil again. He thinks if he's careful enough, nothing else will go wrong. He comes by that honestly, Naomi said. Caleb looked up. She wasn't looking at him. She was stacking the dried plates with quiet efficiency. But she'd said it, and he'd heard it, and there it was. He could have taken that badly. He considered it for a moment and decided he wouldn't. Probably, he said. She glanced at him then. A sideways thing, brief, checking. And when she saw he wasn't angry, something relaxed in her, small but visible. They worked in silence for a while after that, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was the first time that had been true. The second week, the ranch started to feel different. It wasn't one thing. It was an accumulation of small things, the way change usually was. Meals at regular times, which the children had not had in over a year, not for any lack of caring on Caleb's part, but because the rhythm of the ranch didn't run to clockwork, and he'd never learned to enforce it. A clean kitchen, which was somehow not just a cleaner kitchen, but a different quality of evening, the end of a working day arriving in a place that didn't look like a continuation of everything going wrong. The kitchen garden cleared and turned, too late for this season, but ready for the next. Laughter, which was the thing Caleb hadn't expected. Naomi was funny, not in any performing way. She didn't tell jokes or do bits, but she had an eye for the absurd and a dry delivery that caught people off guard. She described the chicken they kept in the yard, who had an elaborate personality and deeply held opinions about the positioning of her nesting box, with such precise seriousness that Ben, who had been eating his breakfast with the composure of a man twice his age, put down his fork and laughed. Actually laughed, the full kind that came from somewhere unguarded, and then looked slightly alarmed at himself. Naomi kept a straight face. "I'm just saying she has standards." "She's a chicken," Ben said. "She's a chicken with standards." Lily had been laughing since the second sentence and was now in the boneless state that children got when they'd laughed too hard. "She does have standards," Lily managed. "She won't lay if you look at her." "See?" Naomi said. "Standards." Caleb, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat half on, had stopped putting his coat on somewhere in the middle of this. He stood there and watched his son laugh, and felt something move through his chest that he didn't try to name because naming it would make it fragile. He left for the barn before anyone saw his face. The town was a different matter. Harlow was not a large community, and the arrangement at the Ashford Ranch was not a secret, because nothing was a secret in Harlow for more than about 48 hours. People knew that Caleb had sent for a mail-order bride, and that the bride who arrived wasn't the one he'd arranged for, and that he'd taken her in on trial anyway. And people had feelings about all of this, which they expressed in the various ways of small frontier communities. Some sympathetic, some skeptical, some with the particular relish that attached to other people's complicated situations. Naomi went to town for supplies on the 9th day, taking the buckboard herself because Caleb was occupied with a fence line that needed immediate attention, and she had said, when he offered to delay it, that she was capable of driving a buckboard and dealing with a general store without supervision. He had not argued, partly because she was right, and partly because he had made a 30-day agreement with a condition about trust, and he intended to keep it. She came back 3 hours later, pulled the buckboard in with competent hands, and unloaded the supplies without particular comment. He was repairing the corral post and watched her from the corner of his eye. At supper, Lily said, "Mrs. Garvey at the dry goods said you weren't the real bride." A pause around the table. "Lily," Caleb said. "She said it to Mrs. Foster, not to me. I was just there." Naomi set down her fork and looked at Lily with the calm attention she brought to most things. "What Mrs. Garvey said is true," she told her. "I'm not who your father originally arranged for. That's not a secret." "Does it bother you?" Lily asked. "When people say it?" "It bothers me a little," Naomi said honestly. "But what bothers me more is what people might decide from it without knowing the whole story." She picked up her fork again. "There isn't much I can do about what people think. I can only do the work." Ben was looking at his plate. "What do they think?" he asked. Quiet, careful. "I don't know exactly," Naomi said. "Probably some of them think your father made a poor decision. Some of them are probably waiting to see if I leave. Some of them are wondering why a woman would come all this way to a ranch she'd never seen to live with a family she'd never met." She paused. "That's a fair thing to wonder, honestly." "Why did you?" Ben asked. He looked up then. The table was quiet. Caleb held himself still. Naomi considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I was out of good options in the place I was," she said, "and I thought this might be a better chance than staying where I was. That's the honest answer. It wasn't very romantic." Ben nodded slowly, like that made sense to him, like the honesty of it was the part that mattered. "People don't have to think it's romantic," he said. "People don't know everything." "No," Naomi agreed, "they don't." Caleb reached for the bread and changed the subject, and the conversation moved on, But something had settled at that table that he thought might be more important than he could measure at the time. But the second week brought another problem because problems on a ranch ran on their own schedule and did not wait for convenient timing. 3 of the heifers had gotten through a gap in the east pasture fence that Caleb hadn't found yet. The fence line went on for half a mile through rough ground, and there was always somewhere it was losing the argument with weather and time. He found the gap on a Thursday morning and spent most of the day on it. And when he got back in the late afternoon, he was tired in the bone-deep way that came from physical work on top of everything else. And he came through the kitchen door and stopped. The kitchen smelled like something that had been cooking for most of the day. Not complicated. A pot roast, the kind of thing you put together in the morning and left to do its work. But the smell hit him in a way that was not straightforward, because it was a smell that belonged to a specific period of his life that had ended, and the ending of it had been the worst thing he had survived. He stood in the doorway for a moment, long enough that Naomi, who was at the table helping Lily with arithmetic homework, looked up. She read his face. She didn't say anything about the smell or ask what was wrong. She said, "There's coffee if you want it," and looked back down at Lily's slate. He crossed to the stove, poured the coffee, stood there a minute. "The fence?" she asked, not looking up. "Fixed." He turned with the cup. "You made pot roast." "I found a good cut at the butcher's when I went to town. I thought it made sense." A pause. "Clara used to make pot roast," he said. He had not meant to say that. It came out anyway. Naomi looked up then. She held his gaze for a moment, steady, careful, and then said, "I can make something else tomorrow." "No." He sat down at the table. "Don't do that. Don't rearrange things around it." He looked at his coffee cup. "It's a good thing to know how to make. The children like it." She was quiet for a moment. Lily was working her arithmetic, apparently absorbed, though Caleb had lived with an 8-year-old long enough to know she was listening to everything. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," Naomi said, low, direct, not defensive. "I know that. I just want to make sure you know I know that." She held his gaze. "I'm not Clara. I'm not trying to be. I'm here to help, and I'm here because I need to be somewhere, and that's the whole of it." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the way the house smelled and the chair by the window, and 14 months of burned porridge and a child crying through a wall. "I know," he said again, and this time he meant it in a different way, the way that meant he had heard her, actually heard her, not just processed the words. Lily looked up from her slate. 2 times 14, she announced, "is 28. "It is," Naomi said, redirecting without hesitation. "Now carry that, and what do you have?" The kitchen settled back around the arithmetic and the coffee and the smell of something cooking, and Caleb sat there and let it, and did not go anywhere. The 3rd week, Ben broke. Not dramatically, not in any way that looked like breaking from the outside except to someone who had been watching. It happened on a Saturday, in the barn, which was where Ben went when things were too large for the house. Naomi had gone looking for him because she'd asked him to bring in more wood 40 minutes ago, and he hadn't come back, and she'd noticed, over the past week and a half, that when he disappeared into the barn, it was usually when something was wrong and not when something needed doing. She found him in the far stall, sitting on a hay bale, in the way boys sat when they didn't want anyone to know they'd been crying. Very still, very controlled, the work of composure visible in his jaw and his eyes. She stood in the barn doorway and did not go to him. "I can go get Caleb," she said. "No." "Quick. Don't." "All right." She came in and sat down on the hay bale across from him, not adjacent, not crowding, just in the same space. "The wood can wait." He didn't say anything. She didn't push. After a while, he said, "She used to do that. What you did last Tuesday." "What's that?" "The thing with the lamp. You trimmed the wick a certain way. She did it exactly like that." He looked at the barn wall, not at her. "I don't know why it—" He stopped. "You don't need a reason," Naomi said. "It's stupid." "It's not stupid. It's just a lamp." "It's not just a lamp, and you know that." She kept her voice level, without softness or force. "It's a lamp that your mother touched the same way, and when you see someone else touch it the same way, it's—" She paused, picking the right word. "It's like hearing her voice from another room, for just a second." Ben was very still. "Yeah," he said. His voice had gone rough at the edge. Yeah, that's, yeah. She did not reach over and put her hand on his shoulder. She did not tell him it would be all right, or that time healed things, or any of the other sentences adults said to children in this situation that were true in the abstract and useless in the specific. She sat there and let him be in it for a while. My father died when I was 13, she said eventually. It wasn't sudden. He was sick a long time, and we knew it was coming. And that was somehow worse in some ways because you spent a long time waiting for the worst thing, and then it happened and you thought you'd be ready and you weren't. She looked at the barn wall. My little brother couldn't be in the kitchen for about 6 months because that's where she always was when she was home. He'd come in and just stop. Ben looked at her. Your mother was in everything, she said. She still is. That's not something that goes away. It just changes shape. She paused. I'm not going to pretend I know what you're going through. I'm not going to tell you it gets easier on any schedule, but I will say that what you're feeling right now isn't weakness. It's just love with nowhere to go. He looked at the barn wall for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not say anything else. Pa doesn't talk about her, he said. I know. Not because he doesn't. He does. He just... Ben struggled with the shape of it. He thinks if he says it out loud, it'll break something. Maybe, Naomi said, or maybe he's not sure you're ready to hear it. Ben looked at her sharply. Grief's funny, she said. People who love each other spend a lot of time protecting each other from it, which means nobody says it out loud and everybody thinks they're the only ones still carrying it. A long silence. The barn settled around them, the particular stillness of an October afternoon. Do you think he'll be okay? Ben asked. He was asking about his father. They both knew it. I think he loves you and your sister more than he knows how to say, Naomi said. I think that has to count for something. Ben nodded slowly. The roughness at the edge of his voice had eased. After a while, he stood up and said, I'll get the wood, and walked out of the barn without looking back, which was how 11-year-old boys ended conversations that had cost them something. Naomi sat on the hay bale for a minute before she followed him. Caleb found out about it secondhand, not from Ben and not from Naomi, from Lily, who had seen her brother's face when he came back from the barn and had the observational acuity of a small person who had learned to track emotional weather for survival. Ben cried, Lily told him, at a volume that suggested she understood this was important but had not yet calibrated appropriately. In the barn, and Naomi stayed with him. Lower your voice, Caleb said. Sorry. She dropped to a stage whisper. Naomi stayed with him. I heard you. Did you know Ben cried? I suspected. He never cries in front of me. He says boys don't cry, but I think that's not true. It's not true, Caleb agreed. Did Naomi tell you? No? Lily processed this. So she didn't tell you? No. Oh. Another pause. She was in there for a long time. I watched from outside. He looked at his daughter, who had Clara's eyes and his own inconvenient habit of noticing everything. She's good with him, he said. She's good with both of us, Lily said. She's different with each of us, though. Have you noticed? What do you mean? Lily worked on this, the way children worked on language that described things they could feel, but not yet name. With me, she made a gesture with her hands, open, expansive. And with Ben, she's quieter. Not because she doesn't care, because he doesn't like it when people are too much. She looked at Caleb thoughtfully. She noticed that. I don't think she even knew she was doing it. Caleb looked at his daughter for a moment. When did you get so observant? He said. Lily shrugged. I've always been observant. You just don't notice because I'm small. He sent her to wash up for supper and sat at the table for a while in the quiet kitchen and thought about what his 8-year-old had told him and what it meant, and whether he had the right to let it mean what it seemed to mean. The problem was this. He had not planned on her. He had planned on Margaret Holloway, the sensible widow, the experienced household manager, the practical arrangement between two adults who needed something and were honest about it. He had planned on something that would function without requiring him to feel anything about it, because feeling things had a cost he was not sure he could afford. Naomi Quinn was 24 years old, and she had shown up with a single bag and a careful honesty and she had gotten down on the floor with his daughter and talked to his son in a barn and made pot roast and organized the pantry so that everything was where it made sense, and the house was different now. He could feel it when he walked in. The shape of it was different, the weight. He was not a man who moved quickly toward things. He had learned, over the course of the past year, to be suspicious of his own wanting, to check it against practicality, to make sure it was real and not just the artifact of loneliness, which could make a man see things that weren't there. So he was checking. He was checking, and what he was finding was that the thing he was feeling when he walked into that kitchen in the evening was not loneliness making things up. It was something else. He didn't do anything about it. It was only the second week, and he had promised 30 days, and he was a man who kept what he promised. But he stopped working quite so hard at staying at the far edge of whatever room she was in. He stopped engineering reasons to be in the barn when supper was ready. He sat at the table and ate with his children and with the woman who was reorganizing his family from the inside out, and he let himself be there, in the simple animal fact of a shared meal, without bracing against it. On the 20th day, Roy Finch came for supper. Roy was not a man who showed up without a reason, and his reason, delivered on the porch before they went in, was that he'd heard things in town that Caleb ought to know about. Things being said about the Ashford Ranch and the woman living there. The specific flavor of things that a small town generated when it felt its social understanding of a situation was being outpaced by the situation itself. What kind of things? Caleb said. The kind where people who don't know the arrangement think they know it anyway, Roy said. Mildred Castor said at the church social that the woman was probably lying about why she came. Said there had to be something she was running from, to come all this way on no notice. Caleb was quiet. I'm not saying it matters, Roy said. I'm saying you should know. It matters to her, Caleb said. If she knows. She probably knows. People in Harlow are not subtle. He went inside, and supper was the way supper had become. The children talking, the food good, the kitchen warm. And if Naomi knew about the things being said, she showed none of it at the table. After the children went to bed, she and Caleb did the dishes, which had become its own quiet rhythm without either of them deciding it, and he said without turning from the window, I heard there's talk in town. A pause in the dish sounds. There is, she said. There's been some for a while. You didn't mention it. It wasn't yours to deal with. She kept washing. They don't know me. They're going to say what people say when they don't have enough information and have strong opinions anyway. I can't stop that. Does it bother you? A longer pause. Honest. Yes, she said, because I've worked hard here and I've tried to be straight with everyone, and I know none of that is visible to people who only see what I look like from the outside. She rinsed a plate. What bothers me more than what they say is the idea that it might make things harder for you or the children, that I might be a problem you have to manage. You're not. I might become one. He turned from the window. She was at the sink, not looking at him, her hands still in the water. Naomi. She looked up. You're not a problem I'm managing, he said. You're someone who has been here 3 weeks and has done every single thing you said you'd do and a number of things you didn't say. He held her gaze. What people say in town is their business until it becomes yours. If it becomes yours, we deal with it together. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Not the relief of a person who had been given something they were desperate for, but something quieter than that. The recognition of a person who has been seen. All right, she said. All right, he said. He went back to the window and she went back to the dishes, and outside the Wyoming night was enormous and cold, and the wind had come down off the mountains and was talking to the eaves, and for the first time in 14 months the house held it without feeling hollow. The 28th day arrived the way the best ones did on the frontier. Clear and cold, and lit from the east with the kind of light that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Caleb was out before sunrise checking the stock, and when he came back in, Naomi had coffee on and was making something with the last of the dried apples that smelled good enough to change the quality of the morning. 2 days left on the 30-day trial, which had stopped feeling like a trial somewhere around day 18. He had not said this to her. He was building toward it. He was a man who built toward things rather than arriving at them suddenly. And he had his words mostly assembled in his head and was waiting for the right moment, which he had not entirely defined yet but believed he would recognize when it came. The shape of what he meant to say was something like, "This is working, and I think we should make it permanent," and underneath those words, further down, things he was not sure he had the language for yet. Lily came downstairs in her school clothes with her hair already half undone from whatever she'd done with it that morning, and Naomi fixed it without being asked, without making it a thing, just reached over while Lily was eating and repinned the pieces that had come loose, and Lily said thank you with her mouth full and didn't stop eating. Ben came down and ate and talked about something his teacher had said about the railroad coming through the county, and Naomi asked 2 questions about it that were genuinely curious, not politely performed, and Ben answered at length. Caleb sat at the table and drank his coffee and watched his family. He had not called it that in 14 months, not even in his head. He almost said it then, almost opened his mouth and said 2 more days and I'd like to talk, but the children were there and it wasn't that kind of conversation, and so he let the moment pass and told himself there would be another one, which he believed because there was no reason not to. He drove the children to school, came back, spent the morning on the water line at the north pasture that had been giving him trouble since September. He was back by noon, ate the lunch Naomi had left on the stove, she had gone to town for the week's supplies, and was in the barn working on a piece of tack that needed restitching when he heard the sound of an unfamiliar horse coming up the drive. He set down the leather and came to the barn door. The man coming up the drive was not someone Caleb had seen before. He was riding a good horse, which was the first thing you noticed, and was dressed in clothes that were too clean for the road he'd just traveled, which was the second thing, medium build, somewhere in his 40s, with the carefully composed expression of a man who had practiced it. He had a leather satchel across one shoulder. He pulled up in the yard and looked at Caleb with something that was not quite a smile. "Mr. Ashford," he said. Not a question. He'd been told what Caleb looked like. "That's right." Caleb came out of the barn. "Can I help you?" "I hope so." The man swung down from the horse with practiced ease. "My name is Garrett Pollard. I represent the Whitmore Marriage Agency out of Chicago." He reached into his satchel and produced a card, which he held out. Caleb took it and looked at it without changing his expression. "I've come regarding the matter of Naomi Quinn." Something went still in Caleb's chest. Not alarm, not yet, but a heightened attention, the kind that preceded alarm when you were paying close attention to something. "What matter?" he said. Pollard glanced toward the house. "Is she here?" "She's in town." "What matter, Mr. Pollard?" The man reached into his satchel again and produced a folder of papers, which he held with the deliberateness of a man who knew the weight of what he was carrying. "Mr. Ashford, the agency sent me because there are concerns, serious concerns, regarding the woman we placed with you." He paused. "Concerns we should have investigated more thoroughly before she was sent. I want you to know that the agency takes full responsibility for the inadequacy of our vetting process in this case." The still thing in Caleb's chest spread. "Say what you came to say," Caleb said. Pollard opened the folder. "Naomi Quinn, born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Before she came to us, she was employed as a bookkeeper at a trading company called Hessler and Marsh in Philadelphia." He looked up. "She was dismissed 18 months ago. The reason given was theft. Specifically, the systematic misappropriation of client funds over a period of approximately 8 months. The amount," he turned a page, "was in excess of $400. The yard was very quiet. "We have the dismissal documents," Pollard said. "We have a sworn statement from the owner of Hessler and Marsh. We have," he produced another page, "a record from the Philadelphia Constabulary indicating that she was questioned in connection with the matter, though formal charges were not ultimately pursued, apparently due to insufficient evidence to prosecute." He looked at Caleb directly. "The agency is deeply sorry, Mr. Ashford. We should have found this before she was placed. She gave us a false employment history, and we didn't dig deeply enough." War seconds. Caleb stood in his yard and looked at the papers. His mind went, in spite of himself, to the pantry organized in the order that made sense, to the accounts she'd helped him straighten out, the budget, the numbers she said she was good at. Good with numbers. Because she'd worked as a bookkeeper, which he now knew, for the first time, from a man with a satchel and clean clothes and documents that looked official. "I'd like to leave copies of these with you," Pollard said. His voice had the careful gravity of a man delivering difficult news to a customer the company had failed. The agency will, of course, arrange and pay for her return passage. We feel responsible for this situation. Leave the papers, Caleb said. His voice came out level. Pollard set them on the top of the fence post with the practiced movement of a man who did this kind of thing and knew how it went. He didn't say anything else. He seemed to understand from Caleb's face that the time for talking had passed. He got back on his horse, rode out the way he'd come, down the drive, and back toward the county road. And the sound of the hooves diminished and then stopped, and Caleb stood in the yard with a folder of papers on his fence post and the October sun going through the cottonwoods. He picked up the papers. He read them twice, slowly. He was not a man who read quickly under any circumstances, and he was less so now, with his blood doing something complicated in his veins. The dismissal document looked legitimate. The sworn statement looked legitimate. The constabulary record looked legitimate. $400 over 8 months. He stood there and thought about Ben telling Naomi about the pump, and Naomi asking exactly the right question. He thought about her in the kitchen with the accounts, the quick, assured way she moved through numbers. He thought about, I'm good with numbers because I've had to be, which was true in a way he hadn't understood at the time. He thought about somewhere that needed me, and whether that was the whole story or whether there had been other reasons to need to be somewhere else very badly. He thought about the engagement she'd mentioned, the situation that had left her without much. He changed his mind. Some things became complicated. Financially. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table with the papers in front of him and the coffee growing cold and waited. She came back at 2 in the afternoon with the week's supplies in the back of the buckboard and a small parcel under one arm that she hadn't mentioned she was getting, which turned out to be a book she'd tracked down at the dry goods for Ben. Something about mechanical engineering that she'd apparently special ordered 2 weeks ago without saying anything about it. She pulled the buckboard into the yard and saw his face and stopped. She stood there in the yard with the parcel under her arm and looked at him in the kitchen doorway, and he watched her register whatever it was she was reading in him, and he watched something change in her face. A bracing, a preparation. And then she said, "What happened?" He stepped back from the doorway so she could come in. She came in and set the parcel on the table and looked at the papers lying there, and he watched her look at them and knew, from the way she went still, that she recognized what they were. A man named Garrett Pollard came from the Whitmore agency, Caleb said. He kept his voice even. He left those. She picked up the top document. She read it. He watched her read it, watched her face, which told him almost nothing. The careful stillness of a person who had lived some hard years and learned to keep things off their face when they needed to. She set it down. "All right," she said. She looked at him steadily. "What do you want to know?" "Were you a bookkeeper at Hessler and Marsh?" "Yes." "Were you dismissed for theft?" A pause. Not an evasive pause, he thought. A precise one. The kind where the person is being careful about what is true and what is not. "I was dismissed for theft," she said. That's what the dismissal papers say, and that's what they would always say, because that's what Edmund Hessler decided to put in them. "And the $400? "There was no $400, she said. "Not the way they've described it." "Then how?" She pulled out the kitchen chair and sat down. Not because she was calm, he thought, but because she had decided she was going to say all of this, and it was going to take some time, and she wasn't going to do it standing up like she was on trial. "I worked at Hessler and Marsh for 2 years, she said. "Edmund Hessler's son, Daniel, he was the one I was engaged to. We were engaged for 8 months. The whole time I worked there, I was good at it. I was careful. I kept his books in better order than they'd been kept in years, and I thought—" She stopped, composed something. "I thought everything was going to be fine. I thought I had something real." Caleb said nothing, let her speak. "Daniel broke off the engagement in March. I found out later it was because his father had arranged a different match, a woman from a wealthy Philadelphia family who would bring connections the business needed. Daniel didn't fight it. He just stopped." She looked at the table. A week after he ended it, Edmund Hessler called me into his office and told me that a discrepancy had been found in the accounts. He had papers showing that $412 had been redirected over 8 months into an account in my name. She looked up. I had never seen that account. I had never opened it. But it existed, and my name was on it, and Edmund Hessler had documents. You're saying it was fabricated. I'm saying it was fabricated, she said. Yes, to give them legal grounds to dismiss me and to make sure I wouldn't be able to work in that city again, because a bookkeeper with theft on her record doesn't work anywhere reputable. And to make sure, she paused, that I would be too busy trying to survive to make any kind of trouble about the way things had been handled. Caleb looked at the papers. The constabulary record, he said. I went to the constabulary myself, she said. I told them what I believed had happened. They questioned me, they looked at the documents, and they concluded there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute either way, which is the formal way of saying they didn't know who to believe and didn't want the trouble of finding out. A beat. Edmund Hessler is a well-connected man in Philadelphia. I was a bookkeeper's clerk with no family and no money and an ex-fiancée who wouldn't speak in my defense. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the papers and then at the woman across the table from him, who was sitting straight and looking at him without flinching and had told her story in the flat, factual way of someone who had already decided a long time ago that she was going to tell the truth about it or not tell it at all. He wanted to believe her. That was the thing he was aware of, with an uncomfortable clarity. He wanted to believe her, and that wanting was exactly the kind of thing he was supposed to check himself against. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Before you came, or when you arrived? She looked at him steadily. Would you have let me stay if I had? The question sat between them. No, he said, because it was true. I know, she said. I know that. I told myself I'd earn the right to tell you, and then I'd tell you. I was building up to it. She paused. That was a mistake. I should have told you sooner, regardless of what it cost me. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the buckboard was still in the yard, the supplies still in the back. The mountains were the same as they always were. Everything looked exactly like it had looked this morning. The trouble was this. He knew what it was to have a story that looked one way from the outside and another way from the inside. He knew what it was to have things said about you in town that were true in the technical sense and false in the sense that mattered. He had been on the receiving end of enough of that in the year since Clara died. The well-meaning and not so well-meaning assessments of his choices and his grief and his parenting, to know that the documents a man produced were not the same as the truth of a situation. He also knew that he was standing in his kitchen wanting to believe the woman behind him, and that this was not the same as having reason to believe her. I need to think, he said. All right. I'm not telling you to leave right now. I need to think. I understand. She stood. I'll bring in the supplies. She went out. He stood at the window and watched her unload the buckboard with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. And he felt something tearing in him in two directions, and he did not know yet which direction was the right one. Well, he thought for the rest of the afternoon. He did it the way he thought about difficult things, which was while working, back to the tack that needed restitching, hands occupied so the mind could go where it needed to go. He went through it methodically. What he knew, what he didn't know, what could be verified. The documents looked real. That was a fact. The agency man had seemed credible. Also a fact. Naomi had lied by omission about her employment history. Undeniable. But also, he had seen her with his accounts. She was careful, meticulous. She had flagged 2 small errors in his own record-keeping without being asked, with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who genuinely could not walk past a mistake. If she had stolen $400 systematically over 8 months, she had done it from inside a careful, conscientious professional life, which was possible, but which did not match anything else he had observed about how she operated. And also, Garrett Pollard had come from the Whitmore agency, the same agency that had taken $60 from Caleb without properly vetting Naomi, the same agency that had sent her without notifying him, the same organization he already had reason to distrust, showing up with documents to tell him the woman was a thief. He sat with that. He sat with it a long time. The children came home from school at 4:30, and supper happened the way it happened, and Caleb sat at the table and ate and was quieter than usual, which Lily noticed, and Ben noticed, and Naomi noticed, and none of them said anything about. After the children went upstairs, Naomi cleared the table, and Caleb sat there and finally said, "Tell me about Daniel Hessler." She stood with a stack of plates, set them back down. "He was 28, she said. He'd worked in his father's firm since he was 22. He could be very kind. I thought he was very kind." She paused. "I think he was kind when it wasn't complicated. When it became complicated, he wasn't. When it became complicated. When his father told him what the match needed to be and what the alternative would cost him." She pulled the plates toward her. "He made his choice. I can't fully fault him for it. Edmund Hessler was not a man you argued with easily." A pause, quieter. "But I fault him for the other part, for not stopping his father, for knowing what Edmund intended to do to me and not doing anything to prevent it." She moved to the sink. "He wrote me a letter afterward, an apology of a kind. He said he was sorry things had gone the way they had. He said he hoped I would understand." She rinsed a plate. "I didn't write back." Caleb was quiet. "What happened to the money?" he asked. "The account that was in your name." "I don't know. I assume Edmund Hessler moved it once its purpose was served. I never had access to it." She kept her back to him, washing. "I couldn't prove any of it. That's the whole of it, Caleb. I couldn't prove what I knew to be true, and the people with power to help me had no interest in helping me, and I was—" She stopped washing, stood at the sink. "I was 23 years old with no family and no money, and a dismissal for theft on my record, and I needed to be somewhere else entirely. I needed to start over somewhere nobody had already decided who I was." Caleb got up from the table and stood in the kitchen with his hands at his sides. He looked at her back, at the set of her shoulders, at the way she was holding herself together in the particular way she had, with no drama, no excess, just the sheer determined effort of a person who had been holding themselves together for a long time and had gotten very good at it. "I'm going to write to Philadelphia," he said, "to verify what I can verify." She turned from the sink. Her face was very still. "That's your right," she said. "It'll take 3 weeks, maybe 4. I know. I'm not asking you to leave while I wait." He looked at her. "But I want to be honest with you. I don't know what I'll find, and I don't know—" He stopped, made himself say it. "I don't know how I feel right now. I'm trying to be fair. I'm not sure I'm managing it." Something moved across her face. Not hurt, exactly. Something more complicated than that. "You're being fairer than most people would," she said. "I'm not sure that's true." "It is." He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind and did not sleep for a long time. The next 3 days were the strangest of the 30 he had spent with her. The household continued to function. Meals were made, the children went to school and came home, the ranch work happened. On the surface, nothing was different, but something had shifted in the air between them. A new carefulness, a new distance. And the children felt it the way children felt these things, through the walls of adult composure, without being told anything. Lily was quieter than usual. She still talked to Naomi, still followed her through the morning chores, but with a slightly subdued quality. A child who sensed weather coming and didn't know from which direction. Ben watched more than he spoke, which was saying something. On the 3rd day, Roy Finch appeared again. Caleb went out to meet him in the yard because Roy arriving uninvited twice in 2 weeks meant something. "Heard Pollard came out," Roy said. "News travels." He stopped at Garvey's dry goods on his way out of town, talked to some people. Roy looked at the house. "People know, Caleb." Caleb said nothing. "What are you going to do?" "I wrote to Philadelphia, waiting on a response." Roy was quiet for a moment. "You believe her?" "I don't know what I believe." "That's not the same as not believing her." "I'm aware of that," Caleb said. Roy looked at him with the steady, uncomplicated regard of a man who had known him for 12 years and had long ago learned exactly how to be useful and when to back off. "Be careful," he said. "Not about her, about yourself. You have a history of making decisions from scared places and calling it caution." "I appreciate that." "I mean it as a friend." "I know you do," Caleb said. "Go home, Roy." Roy went. What? The letter came on a Wednesday, which was 14 days after he'd sent his. He collected it from the post office himself, stood outside on the boardwalk, and opened it right there because he could not stand to carry it back to the ranch unopened. It was from a man named Howard Briggs, who worked as a clerk in the Philadelphia Municipal Records Office and was a cousin of Roy Finch's wife. Roy had suggested the contact, and Caleb had taken it. The letter was 3 pages, and Briggs had been thorough. He had checked the constabulary records. He had spoken to a woman who had worked alongside Naomi at Hessler and Marsh. He had, through a contact of his own, made inquiries about Edmund Hessler and his son. Caleb read it twice, there on the boardwalk with the November wind coming down the street. What Briggs had found, the constabulary records matched what Naomi had said. She had gone to them first, which was not the behavior of someone with a guilty conscience. The woman who had worked with her said she'd been one of the most careful bookkeepers in the firm. Edmund Hessler had a documented history through the same contact of this pattern. It had happened once before, with a different employee, shortly after a different broken business arrangement. And Daniel Hessler had, 2 months after Naomi was dismissed, married the daughter of a railroad man out of New York. Caleb stood on the boardwalk and read the letter a second time. He folded it, put it in his coat pocket, stood there for a moment looking at the street. He thought he would feel relief. What he felt instead was something more complicated. The particular discomfort of a man who had already started to move in a direction before he was sure of his ground, and now had the ground confirmed, but was standing in the space between where he'd stood and where he should go. And the space was not comfortable. He had not sent her away. He had not asked her to leave. He had told himself this meant he was being measured, careful, fair. He drove home. He came in and she was at the table with the accounts. His accounts, which she had been helping him straighten out for 3 weeks. And she looked up when he came in, and he put the letter on the table in front of her. She picked it up and read it. She didn't say anything for a while. He stood across the table and watched her read it. When she finished, she set it down carefully. She was quiet for a moment that was difficult to read. "Does this help?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "It does." She nodded once. "I'm glad." She turned back to the accounts. He sat down across from her. "Naomi." She looked up. "I should have waited for this before making you feel uncertain about your place here," he said. "I knew what I thought I knew about you. I let a man with a folder of papers undo it in an afternoon." She held his gaze for a moment. "You were trying to be careful." "I was trying to protect myself," he said. "That's not exactly the same thing, and I knew that while I was doing it." Something changed in her face, and he thought this was the closest he had seen to her composure actually reaching its limit. She held it, but it took an effort. "I should have told you sooner," she said, "before he came. I knew it was a risk. I kept telling myself there would be a better time." A pause. "There never is there? A better time?" "No," he said. "There usually isn't." They sat across from each other in the kitchen, the accounts between them, the letter from Philadelphia on the table, the afternoon light going gray through the windows. And that was when the door opened. He hadn't heard the buggy. He hadn't heard any approach at all, which later he would think about, the strange silence before it. The door opened, and it was not one of the children, because the children were at school. It was Pollard, and he was not alone. There was a woman with him, thin, dressed well, with the tight expression of someone who had crossed a great distance and was furious about the reasons. Caleb stood. "Mr. Ashford," Pollard said. He looked at Naomi with an expression that was something between satisfaction and something uglier. "I'm sorry to come unannounced again. This is Mrs. Eleanor Voss. She is a business partner of Edmund Hessler, and she has traveled from Chicago specifically." "Get out of my house," Caleb said. Pollard blinked. "Mr. Ashford, I think you need to hear." "I said get out of my house." Caleb did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He moved to the door in 2 steps and held it open. "Whatever you came to say, I don't want to hear it. I've had the information I needed verified independently. I know what happened in Philadelphia, and I know how it happened, and I know who sent you the first time and why." Pollard looked at the letter on the table. Something recalculated behind his eyes. "Mr. Ashford, you took $60 from me to run a vetting process you didn't run," Caleb said. "You sent me a woman without my knowledge or consent. You then sent a man with fabricated documents to undermine her. I don't know what you were paid to do that, but I know you were paid to do it, and I know by whom." He looked at the woman in the doorway. Mrs. Voss, who had the look of someone whose plan was not going the way it had been designed to go. Tell Edmund Hessler that his documents did not have the effect he hoped for. And tell him that if anyone from his organization contacts this ranch again, I'll be writing to the county sheriff and the state bar about the manner in which this agency does business. The woman said nothing. Pollard said nothing. They left. Caleb closed the door. He stood with his hand on the door for a moment, his back to the room. Behind him, Naomi said nothing. He turned around and she was sitting at the table with her hands flat on the surface, looking at him, and her face had completely given way. Not in tears, not in any dramatic collapse, but in the release of something that had been held a very long time. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been braced against something for so long they have forgotten what it feels like to not be bracing. "You knew," she said, "before they came. I read it an hour ago." He came back to the table. "I should have said all of that the minute I came through the door instead of having the conversation we had first. You said what needed saying." She looked at her hands on the table. "I thought, when they came through the door, I thought you might hear them out. I thought you might—" She stopped. "What?" "I thought you might decide it was too complicated," she said, quietly. "That I was too complicated. That it was easier to believe them than to take on all of this." He sat down across from her. "2 days ago, I might have," he said. It cost him something to say that. He said it anyway. She looked at him. "I'm not proud of that," he said. "I know how it felt to be on this side of it the past 2 weeks. I know what I was asking you to live with while I figured it out. It wasn't fair." "You were trying to protect your children," she said. "I was trying to protect myself," he said for the second time. "My children were part of it, but they weren't the whole of it. The whole of it was that I was scared and it was easier to believe the worst than to trust something I wasn't sure I was ready to trust." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere down the drive, a horse moved. Probably Pollard and his companion, leaving. The sound diminished and then was gone. "I need to say something," Caleb said. "And I want you to hear it as what it is and not as something I'm saying because of the letter or because of today." She waited. "You belong here," he said. "Not on trial, not provisionally. You've been here 30 days, and in 30 days you have—" He stopped, because the language was inadequate, and he knew it, and he was not a man comfortable with the inadequacy of language, but he pressed forward anyway. "You've put this family back together in ways I didn't know it needed." Ben laughs. "Lily has her hair done right. The accounts make sense. The house is—" He looked at the table. "It's not empty anymore." She was very still. "I know what I want to offer you," he said. "I know that. I knew it before Pollard came the first time, and I let myself get scared away from it, and I'm done being scared away from things I know." He looked at her. "I'm not going to say it the right way, and I'm not going to make it into more than it is right now, because I think we've both had enough of things being more than they are. But I want you to know—" The door burst open. Not Pollard. Lily. She came in the way she came in from everything, in a rush, her school bag swinging, and she pulled up short when she read the room, the way children did, that immediate atmospheric sensing, and her face went through several versions of uncertainty. Is everything, she looked between them. "Everything's fine," Caleb said. "You look serious." "We were talking." Lily looked at Naomi. Naomi looked back at her. Something passed between them. Some understanding that went through the particular channel that had opened between a woman and a girl over the course of 30 days, and Lily's face settled. "Ben's coming," she reported. "He stopped to look at something in the ditch. He'll be 5 minutes." "Wash your hands," Caleb said. She went. They listened to her feet on the stairs. In the kitchen, Caleb and Naomi sat across from each other in the fading afternoon light, and neither of them finished the sentence that had been interrupted. But Naomi reached across the table and picked up the letter from Philadelphia, the one that said what she had said was true, had always been true, and folded it neatly and set it on top of the accounts. "Thank you," she said. Quietly. Just those 2 words. "You don't need to thank me for believing the truth," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I'm thanking you for going and finding it." Ben came through the door then, smelling of mud and whatever the ditch had contained, and the kitchen filled back up with the ordinary sounds of children at the end of a school day, and Caleb sat at his table and felt the weight of the afternoon settling around all of them like something laid down after a long carry. He would finish what he'd started to say. He knew that. He would find the moment and he would say it, and it would be real because it was true, and not because he was afraid of anything anymore. What he did not know, what neither of them knew, sitting in the warmth of the kitchen while the children tracked mud and argued and filled the room with the specific chaos of being alive, was how little time remained before everything broke apart. It came 2 days later. It came on a Friday in the late morning, and it came in the form of a different man from the agency. Not Pollard, but someone older, with the authority of someone who ran things rather than delivered messages. And this time he brought not just documents, but a witness. The witness was a woman from Harrisburg who said she had known Naomi Quinn for 3 years. And what she said, sitting across the kitchen table from Caleb with Naomi standing by the stove and the man from the agency at the door, was this: that Naomi had stolen from the hat shop where she'd worked in Harrisburg. That she had a pattern of this, moving from place to place, taking what she could, presenting herself as something she wasn't. The woman said it all very calmly and specifically. She named amounts and dates and names of shop owners. Naomi said, "That is a lie." And her voice was steady, but her face had gone pale in a way Caleb had not seen before. The agency man produced more papers, more documents, more signatures. And Caleb, who had just spent 2 weeks frightened, who had just gotten a letter that told him to trust, who had just said to himself that he was done being scared away from things, felt something crack open in him that he recognized from 14 months ago. The crack of loss. The specific, terrible sensation of something you had started to count on being yanked from under you. "Caleb," Naomi said. She looked at him. "This is the same thing. This is Edmund Hessler, or someone working for him. Look at me." He looked at her. He wanted to see what he'd seen for 30 days. He wanted to see the woman who had fixed his daughter's hair and sat with his son in the barn and said somewhere that needed me. But the documents were there, and the witness was there, and the agency man was there, and his heart was doing the thing it did when things went wrong, shutting itself down, door by door, the way he'd learned to do when Clara got sick and he couldn't stop it, the way a man learned to protect himself when protection was all he had left. He looked at Naomi, and for one terrible moment he saw not what he knew, but what he feared. "Get out," he said. The words came out before he had decided on them, which was the worst part. He heard them as if someone else had said them. Naomi stared at him. "Caleb, I need you to leave," he said. His voice was flat and terrible, and he knew it and couldn't stop it. "Take your things. I'll arrange for Roy to drive you to town." Her face did something then that he would spend a long time trying not to remember. Not anger, not tears. Just a final, very quiet closing. The way someone closed a door they had opened with great care and great hope, and were now walking away from forever. "All right," she said. She went upstairs. The agency man said something about the return arrangements. Caleb said nothing. He stood in his kitchen and listened to the sound of the single bag being packed, and he did not go upstairs and he did not stop her, and outside the sky was the gray of November over Wyoming, and the wind was coming and there was a storm in it. She came down 20 minutes later with the bag. She did not look at the agency man or at the witness. She looked at Caleb. "I want you to know," she said, "that everything I told you was true. All of it. What happened in Philadelphia, what happened in Harrisburg, all of it." She held his gaze. "I know you don't believe that right now. I know what those papers look like. But I need you to know that I'm telling you the truth." He said nothing. She walked out. He stood in his kitchen and listened to Roy's buckboard. Roy had arrived, as if he'd known, which he probably had because Roy Finch had an uncanny sense of when he was needed, pull away down the drive. He stood there until the sound was gone. The agency man left. The witness left. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 14 months before a woman arrived on the Tuesday stage with dark eyes and a single bag and a kind of careful honesty he had not known what to do with. Ben came home at 4. He came in the door and stopped. He read the kitchen, the empty space where things had been, the particular silence, and he looked at his father with the dark knowing eyes of an 11-year-old who had already learned what loss felt like. "Where is she?" he said. Caleb couldn't answer. Ben looked at him for a long time. "What did you do?" he said. Ben's question hung in the kitchen like smoke. "What did you do?" Not what happened, not where did she go. What did you do? The specific, accusatory grammar of a child who had already assembled the facts and was asking his father to account for them. Caleb stood at the kitchen window with his back to his son and had no answer that was worth giving. There were more documents, he said finally. More accusations. A witness. From the agency. Yes, the same agency that lied the first time. The words landed the way a flat stone landed on still water. Not dramatically, just true, spreading in all directions. Caleb turned from the window. Ben was standing by the door with his school bag still over his shoulder and his face doing the thing it did when he was past the point of hiding what he felt, which was rare enough that the sight of it did something to Caleb's chest. I don't know if they lied this time, Caleb said. Yes, you do. Ben's voice was even, almost too even, the specific control of a boy holding something very large. You knew when you looked at her. I could see it from the door. Caleb said nothing because he didn't have anything to say to that. She told the truth, Ben said. Every time. Everything she told us was true, and you sent her away because you got scared, and you didn't want to. He stopped, jaw working. You didn't want to have to trust somebody again. Ben. Am I wrong? The kitchen held the question. No, Caleb said. You're not wrong. Something shifted in Ben's face. Not relief, not vindication, just the particular pain of being right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. He put his bag on the floor. He sat down at the table in the chair that had been, for 30 days, the chair across from where Naomi usually sat. When does the eastbound stage go? He said. Saturday morning. That's tomorrow. I know. Ben looked at the table. She's at Mrs. Dunnett's. Probably. Then you have tonight. Caleb looked at his son. 11 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with Clara's eyes and Clara's stubbornness, and something else that was entirely his own, a kind of direct moral clarity that Caleb had not known what to do with when it turned itself toward him. It's not that simple, Caleb said. I can't just... It is that simple, Ben said. You know it is. You're making it complicated because you're scared, and it's easier to be complicated than to be scared. He met his father's eyes. She came all this way. She did everything right. She told us the truth when she didn't have to. And you sent her away because a man in clean boots showed up with papers. He paused. Ma would have told you that was a mistake. The mention of Clara was not a weapon. It didn't feel like one. It felt like what it was, a fact that Ben had sat with carefully before saying it, the way he sat with most things. Caleb felt something break open in his chest that had been building since the buckboard pulled out of the drive. Where's Lily? He said. Mrs. Garrett walked her home and saw what was happening and took her back to her place. A pause. She said to send word when things were settled. Caleb put on his coat. He did not go to Mrs. Dunnett's first. He went to Roy's place, which was 3 miles east, because Roy Finch had driven Naomi into town and would know where things stood, and also because Caleb needed someone to tell him things he did not want to hear in a way he could actually receive them, which was something Roy had always been capable of without making a production of it. Roy was in the barn when Caleb rode in. He came out and looked at Caleb's face and said, How bad? I sent her away. Roy was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a man who had expected this and taken no pleasure in being right. She's at Dunnett's, he said. Stage is at 9 tomorrow morning. I know. So what are you doing here? Caleb got off his horse. I don't know what to say to her. The truth, Roy said. It's generally what works. I said things that... He stopped. I didn't say anything. That was the problem. I just stood there and let her go and didn't say a word in her defense. Yeah. Roy didn't soften that. That was the problem. She's not going to... She has every reason not to hear me out. She does, Roy agreed. That doesn't mean she won't. Caleb looked at the barn wall. And if she doesn't? Then you live with that, Roy said. Same as you live with everything else. But you don't get to skip the part where you go and say it. What if I say it wrong? Roy looked at him for a long moment with the patience of someone who had known him for 12 years and understood the specific ways in which Caleb Ashford was his own worst obstacle. Caleb, he said, you've been saying the wrong thing or nothing at all for 14 months, and somehow your children still love you, and your ranch is still standing, and that woman lived in your house for 30 days and looked at you the way she looked at you. You're not going to word yourself out of this. Just go." Caleb got back on his horse. Oh. Mrs. Dunnett answered the door with an expression that told him she had been expecting him and was not sure he deserved to be expected. "She's in the back room," she said. "She hasn't come out for supper." "Is she all right?" Mrs. Dunnett gave him a look that said the question was both necessary and inadequate. "She's composed," she said, "which is different from all right." She stepped aside to let him in. "Don't make it worse, Caleb." He walked through this boarding house to the back room, which was the smaller of the two guest rooms, and had a window that looked out on the alley and the back of the hardware store. He knocked. A pause. "Who is it?" "Caleb." A longer pause, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to open it. The door opened. She was still dressed, hadn't changed for the evening, and her hair had come down on one side and she hadn't fixed it, and she looked at him with an expression that was the most closed he had ever seen on her face. Not angry, just closed, the way things closed when they'd been opened too many times and needed to stay shut for a while. "What do you want?" she said. "To talk." "You didn't have much to say this afternoon." "I know." She looked at him steadily. He could see the cost of just standing there, the deliberate act of not shutting the door, of giving him whatever this was. "5 minutes," she said. She stepped back. He came in. The room was small. A bed, a chair, the single bag on the floor looking exactly as it had looked the day she stepped off the stage. 32 days ago. He stood in the middle of the room, and she stood near the window, and between them was the worst thing he'd done in recent memory. "I was wrong," he said. She said nothing. "I knew when I looked at you that you were telling the truth. Ben knew. The fact that a man walked into my house with more papers—" He stopped, made himself continue. "I used it. I used it as a reason to do the thing I'd been building toward doing since the first time Pollard came. I got scared, and I called it caution, and I let you walk out of my house into the cold, and I didn't say a single word." Naomi had her arms crossed, not defensively, just the posture of someone keeping themselves together. "Why are you here?" she said. "The stage is in the morning. It's already arranged." "Because I'm not done saying what I should have said." "Caleb, I'm asking you to let me finish." He held her gaze. "Please." She was quiet. Something flickered in her face. "I have been afraid," he said, "since Clara died, of building anything I could lose again. I told myself it was practicality. I told myself the arrangement with the agency was practical. No feeling, no risk, no exposure. Just help for the children and help with the ranch, and everyone walks away with what they came for." "Mikita," he paused. "And then you showed up instead of who I planned for, and nothing was practical after that. From the first day, the way you were with Lily, the way you sat in that barn with Ben, the way you told me the truth about things even when the truth cost you." Oosh. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I started to trust you," he said, "and I started to feel things I hadn't felt in over a year. And when Pollard came back with more papers and a witness, I had a choice. I could trust what I knew about you, or I could find a reason to be scared. And I chose to be scared because it was easier than risking being wrong about something I needed to be right about." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the November wind moved down the alley. "I know that's not an excuse," he said. "I know sorry doesn't fix what it felt like to walk out of that house. I'm not here with excuses. I'm here because tomorrow that stage leaves and you'll be on it, and I will have let the best thing that's happened to this family in a year and a half walk away because I was a coward, and I cannot—" His voice shifted just slightly, and he steadied it. "I cannot stand in front of my son and my daughter and tell them that's who I am. And I cannot stand in front of you and not say that I know what I did." Naomi uncrossed her arms. She turned to the window. He couldn't see her face. "You have to understand something," she said. Her voice was low. "I came here with nothing. I told you that from the first day. And I built something here. In 30 days, I built something with those children, with that house, with—" She stopped. And you took it away. Not because I did anything wrong, because you got scared. She turned back to him. Do you know what that's like? To have something taken from you that you built honestly for the second time? I think I'm beginning to, he said. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to forget it, he said. I'm not asking you to pretend this afternoon didn't happen. I'm asking us. He stopped because he had gotten to the part he hadn't rehearsed, the part that came from somewhere below the prepared words. I'm asking if there is any part of you that believes I can be better than I was today. Because I believe it. Not because I feel good about myself right now. I feel terrible about myself right now. But because I have spent 30 days watching you operate, and I have learned something from it about what it looks like to actually trust a person. Naomi looked at him for a long time. What did Ben say? She said. The question was unexpected. He almost smiled in spite of everything. He said I was scared and I was making it complicated because scared was easier than complicated. He's 11 years old. He's smarter than I am. Something shifted in her face. The closed quality didn't open exactly, but it changed, became less a barrier and more a door that might, with sufficient reason, move. I'm not making any decisions tonight, she said. All right. I mean that. I'm not going to tell you yes or no in this room tonight because I'm angry and I'm tired and I don't trust myself to decide things clearly in that condition. All right, he said. That's fair. Come back in the morning, she said, before the stage, and say what you have to say in the daylight when I'm not angry. He looked at her. What I have to say. You've been building towards something for a week, she said. You didn't finish it yesterday and you didn't finish it tonight. If you have something real to say it tomorrow in the daylight and mean it. He held her gaze for a moment. I'll be here at 7, he said. She nodded once. He left. He did not sleep. He lay in the ranch house in the dark and listened to the wind and went through things in his head in the methodical way he went through difficult things. But this time, the method broke down somewhere around midnight, because what he was working on was not a practical problem with a practical solution, and he did not have the right tools for it. Ben knocked on his door at around 2 in the morning. Caleb said, "Come in," and Ben came in and sat on the edge of the bed in his nightclothes, with his hair disordered and the look of a boy who also hadn't slept. Did you talk to her? Ben said. Yes. And? I said what needed saying. She told me to come back in the morning. Ben absorbed this. Is she going to stay? I don't know. A pause. I think I need to ask her properly. In a way I should have asked a long time ago. Ben was quiet for a moment. Then, are you going to? Yes. Ben nodded slowly. He sat there for a minute in the dark. This boy who had been through a year and a half of things no 11-year-old should have to carry, who had stood in the kitchen that afternoon and asked his father, what did you do with the kind of directness that came from someone who'd learned the cost of things not being said? She fixed things, Ben said. Not all at once. She just kept doing the next thing, even when things were hard, even when you were, he paused, distant. I know. I don't want to go back to before, Ben said. Not dramatically, just the flat truth of it. I know that too. Ben got up. He went back to his room without another word. Caleb lay in the dark and thought about what it meant to have raised a child like that, with whatever mess and grief and failure had been the texture of the past 14 months. And to have a child like that look at him and tell him what was true. He got up at 5. He did the morning chores in the dark with a lantern, fed the stock, fixed the split rail on the north corral that he'd been putting off for a week. He worked because he could not do nothing, because his hands needed to be occupied while the rest of him prepared for the thing he was going to do. At 6:30, he hitched the buckboard. He told Ben he'd be back with her, or he'd be back alone and he'd explain either way. And Ben said okay, in the careful way that meant he was holding something tightly. He drove to Harlow. The town was only beginning to be awake at 7 on a Saturday morning. Smoke from the hotel chimney, a man walking his horse toward the livery, the particular stillness of a street that hasn't decided to be a street yet. He tied up in front of Mrs. Dunnett's and knocked. She answered already dressed, which meant she'd been up for a while, which meant she'd known what this morning was. She's on the porch, Mrs. Dunnett said. Back porch. He went through the house, and out the back door and found Naomi sitting on the top step of the back porch with a coffee cup and her coat on, looking at the alley and whatever the alley looked out on beyond itself. The flat November light, the buildings, the mountains at the far edge of the sky. She looked like she'd slept some and not enough. She heard him and turned. He sat down on the step beside her. Not across from her. Beside her. She moved slightly to make room and handed him the coffee cup without being asked, and he drank from it and handed it back. And for a moment they just sat there in the early morning cold of Harlow, Wyoming, not saying anything. Then he said, "I want you to marry me." She was quiet. "Not as a trial," he said. "Not as an arrangement or a practical solution or a 30-day assessment. I want you to marry me because you are the most honest person I have been in the same room with in a long time, and because my children are better with you than without you, and because I am better with you than without you. And I know that, and I have known that for weeks. And I let fear talk me out of it yesterday, and I am done letting fear make my decisions." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the alley. "I am not good at this," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I am not good at saying what I feel before it becomes a problem. I am not good at trusting things until they've proven themselves 6 ways, which is unfair to the things. I have a ranch with problems and 2 children who are not easy and a year and a half of grief that is still in the walls of that house." He paused. "I'm asking you to take that on, knowing all of it, and I am promising you that what you get in return is someone who will never again let a man with a folder of papers talk him out of knowing what he knows." Naomi turned the coffee cup in her hands. "You're asking me to trust you again," she said. "Yes. After yesterday. Yes. That's a large thing to ask." "I know it is," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at the mountains over the rooftops at the end of the alley. He looked at them too. November had sharpened them to something almost painful, the kind of clarity that only came with cold. "What changed?" she said. "Between this afternoon and now? What actually changed?" He thought about it the way she deserved, actually thought about it, didn't reach for the easy answer. "Ben asked me what I did," he said, "not what happened. What did I do? And I had to stand there and know the answer." He paused. "I've spent a year and a half making decisions from a scared place and calling it responsibility. Yesterday was the worst version of that. And I am tired of being the scared version of myself. I am tired of protecting myself at the expense of everything worth protecting." Naomi was quiet for a long moment. "I need something from you," she said. "Tell me." "I need it to not be words," she said. "I've had enough of words this week. I need it to be something real, something that costs you something, so that I know it's not just this morning, and then we go back to the ranch, and everything is the same. And the next time something frightens you, I'm the thing you let go of again." He understood that. He had known, somewhere in the sleepless hours of last night, that she would need this. "All right," he said. He stood up. She looked up at him. "Where are you going?" "Main Street," he said. "Garvey's will be opening, and Mildred Castor will be walking to the dry goods because that's what she does on Saturday mornings. And Roy will be in for his mail." Naomi stood slowly. "Caleb, you said you needed something real," he said. "Something that costs something." He looked at her. "Come with me." She came. They walked through the boarding house and out onto the main street of Harlow in the early morning. And he did not walk ahead of her or behind her, but beside her. And he did not look like a man doing something difficult. Or rather, he did look like that. But he was doing it anyway, which was the relevant thing. Garvey's dry goods was open. Through the window, Caleb could see 2 women inside and Roy Finch at the far end of the counter, and the salesman who'd been in town 2 days and hadn't left yet. He pushed open the door. The bell above the door announced them. Roy turned. The 2 women turned. The salesman, out of politeness, turned. Behind the counter, Frank Garvey looked up from the books he'd been going over. Caleb stopped in the center of the floor with Naomi beside him. "Morning," he said, dressing the room, all of it, without picking a specific face. A murmured morning in return. "I want to say something," he said, "to anyone in this room and to anyone it travels to after, which in this town will be everyone, so that covers it." The room was very still. "There have been things said about Naomi Quinn," he said. "Things that started with a man from a Chicago agency who came to my ranch twice with documents that were—" He paused. documents that were produced for purposes that had nothing to do with the truth. He kept his voice level and did not look away from the room. She has been accused of things she did not do. I know that. I have verified it. And I want everyone in this room and everyone outside this room to know that whatever doubts have been circulating about her character, those doubts were manufactured. And I should have said so loudly and clearly the first time, instead of letting it sit while people made up their minds about her. Mildred Castor, who had come in sometime in the first 10 seconds, was standing by the thread display with an expression that had gone through several phases and landed on something that was at least partially mortified. Roy was looking at Caleb with an expression that could not be described as anything other than satisfied. She has been in my home for 30 days, Caleb continued. She has been good to my children and good to my ranch and honest with me even when honesty cost her. She came here as a stranger and she worked without complaint and without drama, and she told me the truth about things that were difficult to tell. He looked at the women by the thread display. Whatever you have heard about her, if it came through the Whitmore Agency or anyone connected to a man named Edmund Hessler in Philadelphia, it was a lie. And I should have defended her in this town from the beginning, and I did not, and that's on me. Silence. Roy said from the counter, "Took you long enough." Frank Garvey, who was a practical man and didn't waste time on ceremony, said, "What are you buying, Caleb?" The room shifted back toward morning. Naomi beside him was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone who had prepared for a quiet walk back to the stagecoach and found something else entirely. He looked at her. "I'm not done," he said quietly. "Not to the room. To her." She looked at him. He turned back to the room, and to Roy specifically, because Roy was the one who mattered most in this town and had been his witness for 12 years. "I'm asking Naomi Quinn to marry me," he said, "properly, with full knowledge of everything, of the ranch, of the children, of the kind of man I am and the kind of man I'm trying to be. And I'm saying it here because she asked for something that cost something, and the thing that costs me something is being wrong in public, which I have been, and saying so in the same public." He turned to Naomi. She was looking at him with something in her face that was so unguarded it was almost difficult to look at directly. Not a wall, not a careful composure, not the measured distance she'd maintained for 30 days of trial and uncertainty. Just her, in the morning light of a dry goods store in Wyoming, taking in what had just been said. "I'm asking," he said, "just to her now. Not because I have to, not because the arrangement requires it, because you're the person I want to ask." The room was very quiet. Naomi looked at him for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 seconds. "I heard what you said," she said. "Last night and this morning and just now. I know. And I need you to understand something before I answer." She held his gaze. "If I say yes, it is not because I have nowhere else to go. I want to be clear about that. I made it to 30 days in that house, and I could make it on my own if I needed to. I'm not saying yes because I'm out of options." "I know that," he said. "I know that about you." "I'm saying it because I want to be sure you know I have a choice," she said. "That it matters, that I'm choosing." "It's the only thing that matters," he said. She looked at him another moment. He could see her working through it, not stalling, not performing hesitation, but doing the actual work of a person making a real decision. "Then yes," she said. "But we do this honestly. From here forward, everything honest." "Everything honest," he said. Roy started to say something, and Mrs. Dunnett, who had apparently materialized in the doorway at some point, gave him a look that stopped him. Mildred Castor, to her credit, looked at her thread and said nothing at all. Frank Garvey went back to his books. They walked out of Garvey's into the main street of Harlow, with the morning getting properly started around them. Horses, a wagon from the North Road, the hotel putting chairs out on its porch. Naomi walked beside him, and the cold air was sharp, and the mountains were the permanent, unreasonable size they always were. "The stage is at 9, she said. "I know." "I wasn't on it anyway," she said. "For what it's worth." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She looked at the street ahead of them. "I'd already decided this morning, before you came, that I wasn't getting on the stage." A pause. "I was trying to figure out what to do instead." "When did you decide?" "Sometime around 4 in the morning." She glanced at him sideways. When I stopped being angry long enough to think. He absorbed this. You could have told me that on the porch. You needed to say what you said, she told him. Not for me, for yourself. He thought about that. Roy says I make decisions from scared places and call it caution. Roy seems like a perceptive man. He's insufferable, Caleb said. But yes. She almost smiled. Almost. The real version was still somewhere behind the morning's events, but its outline was visible. They walked back toward Mrs. Dunnett's, and at the corner of the main street, Caleb stopped. She stopped beside him. Ben's going to say he told me so, he said. He's 11. He's allowed. Lily's going to be... He searched for the word. Insufferable, Naomi said, in the best possible way. Yes. She looked at the boarding house at the end of the block. What do we do now? I take you home, he said, and we figure out the rest as it comes. She looked at him for a moment. That's the most practical thing you've said since this morning. I'm a practical man. You are, she agreed, when you're not being scared. He let that sit. It was fair. Can we go get your bag? He said. Yes, she said. Let's go get my bag. Go on. They stopped on the way back to the buckboard at the post office because Caleb had a letter to send to Howard Briggs in Philadelphia, asking him to continue what he'd started, to dig further, to find whatever could be found that would formally clear what needed clearing. Naomi stood beside him while he wrote it at the small desk by the window, and when he sealed it and handed it across the counter, she did not say anything, but he felt her look at him. He picked up the bag from Mrs. Dunnett's. Mrs. Dunnett pressed Naomi's hand when she came to say goodbye and said, "Come to supper sometime," which from Mrs. Dunnett was the equivalent of a formal declaration of allegiance. They loaded up and drove out of Harlow in the morning light. The 6 miles back to the ranch went in a particular quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of the first day, not the careful quiet of the trial period, but something else, something that had earned its own texture. He drove, and she sat beside him, and the horses went along the river road, and the cottonwoods had lost most of their leaves by now, the branches black and intricate against the sky, and the mountains said what they always said. About halfway, she said, "Tell me something." "What?" "Something you haven't told me yet. Something true." He drove for a moment, thinking about it. "I knew by the end of the first week," he said, "that I wanted you to stay. Not for practical reasons. I told myself it was practical, but I knew it wasn't." She was quiet. "And the 30-day trial," he said. "I'd already made my decision on about day 15. I just didn't know how to say it without it meaning more than I was ready to say it meant." She looked at the road. "What were you afraid of?" "That it would go wrong," he said. "That I would trust it, and it would go wrong, and I'd be back where I was. That the children would trust it, and it would go wrong, and I'd have done that to them again." "And now?" He thought about it honestly, the way she'd been honest with him from the beginning. "Still afraid," he said, "but less afraid of the wrong thing. I was afraid of losing something. I should have been afraid of throwing it away." She nodded slowly. "That's the difference, isn't it? Between things that happen to you and things you do." "Yes?" "For what it's worth," she said after a moment. "I was afraid too. I've been afraid the whole time." "Of what?" "That I would do everything right and it still wouldn't be enough. That it would turn out that there wasn't room for me here. Not really, not permanently, and that I'd have done all of it for 30 days and then gone back to nothing." She looked at the road. "That's a specific kind of afraid, when you work for something knowing you might lose it anyway." "I know that kind," he said. "I know you do." They drove on. The ranch came into view at the bend. The barn, the house, the corral, with the patched post on the north side that she'd watched him fix 2 weeks ago. The same creek, the same mountains, the same and different. As they pulled into the yard, the kitchen door opened and Ben came out. He stood on the porch step in the cold without a coat, because he had heard the buckboard and had not taken the time for a coat, and he looked at the buckboard, at his father, at the woman beside him, and his face did the thing it did when he did not want to show too much. He turned and went back inside. 30 seconds later, he came back out with Lily's coat and his own, and behind him Lily came through the door like a small, fast-moving weather event, and she got down the porch steps and crossed the yard in about 4 steps, and threw herself at Naomi before Naomi had fully climbed down from the buckboard. Naomi caught her. She held Lily the way she'd sat beside Ben in the barn. Not too much, not too little, just present. Lily buried her face in Naomi's coat and held on. Ben came down the steps more slowly. He stopped at the edge of the yard, hands in his coat pockets. He looked at Naomi and then at his father with a look that said what it said. "She's staying?" he said. "She's staying," Caleb said. Ben looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked up at Naomi, and she looked at him over the top of Lily's head. And something passed between them that was the continuation of a barn conversation from 3 weeks ago. And Ben said, "The north fence post needs resetting. The one Pa fixed is already leaning." "I can hold the post," Naomi said. "If someone tells me where to stand." Ben almost smiled. He turned toward the barn. "I'll get the tools," he said. Caleb stood in the yard of his own ranch in the November cold with Lily wrapped around Naomi, and Ben disappeared into the barn, and he felt, not happiness exactly, because happiness was too smooth a word for something that had so many rough edges, but something that was the honest precursor to it. The particular feeling of a man who has gone to the edge of losing everything and come back with something real in his hands. Not easy, not perfect, not the practical arrangement he had engineered with the agency back in August. Something better than that, something that had required all 30 days and one terrible afternoon and a sleepless night and a hardware store on a Saturday morning and 2 children who were smarter about the important things than their father. "Come on," Naomi said to Lily. "Let's get inside. You're not wearing a coat." "I'm not cold." "You are. You just don't notice." "How do you know?" "Because I was 8 once," Naomi said, "and I never noticed either." Lily considered this as if it were a remarkable fact about the nature of being 8. She let go and took Naomi's hand and pulled her toward the house, and the door opened and closed behind them, and Caleb stood in the yard another moment. He had asked for 30 days. He had gotten 32 days and one very bad afternoon, and a morning that had cost him something he hadn't had to spend in a long time. The debt, he thought, was worth it. He went inside. The north fence post held. Ben had been right that it was leaning. Caleb's repair had been solid enough for a week, but the ground shifted in the freeze and the footing had gone soft underneath. They fixed it properly that same afternoon, the 3 of them, Ben directing the operation with the focused authority of a boy who knew what he was doing and had decided, apparently, to let the morning's events settle into the ordinary business of the ranch as quickly as possible. Naomi held the post. Caleb drove the stakes. Ben checked the level twice, because once was insufficient for a job done right. It was a fence post. It was also, in the way that small things sometimes carried the weight of larger ones, the first thing they fixed together after everything had almost come apart. When they came in for supper, Lily had set the table, all 4 places. She had done it without being asked, which was not her usual mode of operation, and she had put the good cups out, which were normally reserved for occasions. And she looked at Naomi when they came through the door with an expression of absolute satisfaction, as if things had returned to their correct position in the universe and she had known all along they would. Nobody said anything about the morning. Not directly. There was among the 4 of them a tacit agreement that what had happened was known and understood and did not need to be performed for one another's benefit. That was something Caleb noticed in the weeks that followed, how they had moved, collectively, past the need to narrate their own story to themselves. What had happened had happened. What was true was true. They were building the next part. Howard Briggs wrote back from Philadelphia 6 weeks later. The letter was the longest yet, 4 pages, close written, and what it contained was the kind of information that took time and patience and the right contacts to assemble. Briggs had found a former clerk at Hessler and Marsh who had left the firm the same year as Naomi and was, it transpired, willing to speak plainly about what he'd witnessed. He had found a second woman, a supplier's wife, who had seen the account documentation before it was formally presented to Naomi and had always thought the timing of it strange. He had found, through a contact at the Philadelphia Municipal Financial Registry, evidence that the account supposedly opened in Naomi's name had in fact been opened with credentials that did not match her signature on any other document in the firm's records. What Briggs had assembled was not a legal case, precisely. It was something more and less than that. A body of evidence that told a story, clearly and in detail, to anyone who read it without the prior assumption of guilt. Caleb read it at the kitchen table. Naomi read it beside him. When they finished, she set down the last page and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. "It's not a court verdict," she said. No, Caleb agreed, but it's the truth, documented, and that's what matters for what comes next. What came next was a letter, not to the Philadelphia Constabulary, which neither of them had illusions about, but to the county sheriff of their own territory, and to the state licensing board that oversaw marriage agencies operating in Wyoming, and to the regional offices that monitored business conduct across the interstate corridor. Not with the expectation of dramatic justice, because dramatic justice was largely a thing that happened in dime novels and not in actual frontier counties in November, but with the straightforward intention of putting the truth on record somewhere it could not be easily unmade. Roy Finch helped with the language. Roy had a lawyer's instinct for precision without any of a lawyer's fondness for complication, and the letters they sent were clear and specific and attached copies of Briggs's findings. They sent them in December, right before the snow came in earnest. 3 months later, in March, a response arrived from the state licensing board indicating that the Whitmore Marriage Agency's operating license in Wyoming had been suspended pending review of its business practices. Caleb read that letter and passed it to Naomi without comment. She read it and handed it back. "It's not enough," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's something. It means someone else won't go through what I did." "That's what it means," he said. She folded the letter and put it in the box where they kept the important papers. It was a wooden box that had been Clara's, used for letters and certificates and the small formal documentation of a life. Naomi had not reorganized it. She had simply begun using it for the papers that were theirs now, layered over the ones that had always been there, the way new seasons layered over old ones without erasing them. They were married in January, not with fanfare, because neither of them was built for fanfare, and because the logistics of a January wedding on a frontier ranch were their own sufficient challenge without adding ceremony to it. Roy Finch was there, and Mrs. Dunnett, who had dressed for the occasion with impressive formality and cried during the proceedings with equal formality, as if weeping were something she had also prepared for. Frank Garvey came. A woman named Pearl Garrett, who had taken Lily in on the bad afternoon, came with her husband and brought a cake. The justice of the peace was a man named Ira Hollis, who had been performing marriages in the county for 22 years and had the manner of someone who had seen all the varieties of the occasion and remained, after 2 decades, genuinely interested in each one. He looked at Caleb and Naomi across his small office and said, in his plain way, "Do you want the long version or the short version?" Caleb looked at Naomi. Naomi looked at Caleb. "The honest version," Naomi said. Ira Hollis smiled at that. "That's always the shortest one," he said. It took 11 minutes. Lily stood between Roy and Mrs. Dunnett and held both their hands simultaneously and looked at her father and at Naomi with the absorbed attention of someone witnessing something she had already decided was important. Ben stood slightly apart with his arms at his sides, not crossed, not braced, just at his sides, and watched the whole thing with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. This one had no defense in it. When it was done and Ira Hollis had signed what needed signing, Ben said to Naomi quietly, while the adults were doing the adult business of congratulations, "I know you're not replacing her." Naomi looked at him. "I know what this is," he said, "and what it isn't." He paused. "I just wanted to say that out loud. So you knew I knew." "I know you knew," she said. "Good." He looked at the floor, then back up. "I'm glad you're here." 3 words from an 11-year-old who did not give them easily. She understood exactly what they cost him and exactly what they were worth, and she did not make too much of it, which was exactly right. "Me too," she said. Spring came the way it came in Wyoming, reluctantly, in stages, with reversals. There were 3 more snows after the January thaw that everyone had been fooled by, and a week in February where the cold came back so hard the waterline froze, and Caleb and Ben spent 2 days dealing with it while Naomi kept the kitchen warm and maintained a steady production of coffee and meals that appeared at intervals precise enough to suggest she was calculating exactly when they would need them. The kitchen garden she had turned over in October was the first thing she planted in April, when the ground finally allowed it. She had been planning it since the fall, had sketched it out on paper over the winter, made lists of what the kitchen used most, what grew well in their altitude and soil. Caleb had watched her do this over 3 or 4 evenings without commenting, until one night he sat down across from her and said, "You've got onions where the carrots did well last year." She looked up. Carrots like that northeast corner, he said. Something about the drainage. She looked at her sketch, moved the notation. What else? He sat down and they spent an hour on it, talking about the garden with the same practical directness they had learned to bring to most things. And by the end, the plan was better than either of them had made alone, and that felt like its own kind of statement. The garden that year was the best the ranch had produced in 3 years. Not because of magic, because of planning and actual knowledge of the soil, and 2 people contributing what they each knew. The ranch's accounts, by that same spring, had moved from managed but precarious to something closer to stable. Not comfortable. Comfortable was a few good years away, if they came, but stable. Naomi had found 3 places in Caleb's supplier contracts where he was paying above what was reasonable and had simply, with his knowledge, renegotiated them. She had found a buyer for their excess eggs and dairy through a restaurant in the county seat that was willing to pay consistently, which was worth more than a higher price that came and went. Small things. The kind of small things that added up when someone paid attention to them steadily over time. Caleb watched all of this with the particular feeling of a man who had been carrying weight on one shoulder for a long time and had begun, gradually, to distribute it. It was not a comfortable transition, exactly. He had habits of self-sufficiency that were bone-deep and didn't yield easily. But it was a real one. She was not managing him. She was working beside him. The difference mattered. Lily turned 9 in March, and the birthday had the quality of a before and after marker in a way none of them said out loud. Her 8th birthday had been quiet and sad at the edges, the shadow of Clara's absence too recent and too large to see past entirely. Her 9th was different. Naomi made the cake, yellow with a boiled sugar frosting that she had apparently been planning for 2 weeks, because Caleb found notes about it in the margins of her shopping list. And Roy came, and Pearl Garrett's daughters came, and the house was full of children in the way that houses needed to be full of children sometimes, loud and careless and briefly chaotic. Lily, amid the chaos, at some point that afternoon sat down next to Naomi on the porch step and said, with the directness that was her most persistent characteristic, "Do you think about having your own kids? Like, your own ones?" A pause. Naomi looked at the yard full of children. "I'm sitting next to one of mine right now," she said. Lily considered this. "I meant ones you made yourself." "I know what you meant." Naomi looked at her. "I don't know yet. I think about it sometimes. Does that bother you?" Lily thought about it with genuine seriousness. "No," she decided. "I think there's enough room." She paused. "But I want to be clear that I am not sharing my room." "Noted," Naomi said. "Ben won't share his room either. He'll say maybe, but he means no." "I'll keep that in mind." Lily seemed satisfied. She went back to the yard, back to the other children, back to the business of being 9 on a warm March afternoon. Naomi sat on the step and watched and let herself have the moment. The specific, uncomplicated pleasure of a birthday going well, of noise and cake, and a child who had asked her a sincere question and accepted a sincere answer and gone back to playing. She had not had many of those moments before this. The uncomplicated ones. Most of her pleasures in recent years had been qualified. Good things happened inside the context of hard circumstances, which changed their texture. This one was clean. She noticed that it was clean and held that noticing for a moment before Lily called her name from the yard, and she went. Summer came. Ben turned 12 in June, which he treated as a serious and significant event. And it was. 12 meant more responsibility on the ranch, which he had been angling toward for months, with the strategic patience of a boy who knew that making himself indispensable was more effective than asking. Caleb gave him the morning feeding as a permanent responsibility and the authority to make small decisions about the stock without consulting anyone first, and Ben received both of these with the gravity they deserved, and then went to the barn and was in there for an extra hour that evening doing things that did not strictly need doing, just because the barn was his now, in a way it hadn't quite been before. Naomi had given him the book on mechanical engineering, the one she'd special ordered 2 months before the bad afternoon, the one that had been sitting in a parcel on the kitchen table when everything fell apart. She had kept it through all of it, through the boarding house and the almost stage in the morning on Garvey's porch. When she gave it to him for his birthday, he looked at the package and then at her and said, You kept this. I special ordered it, she said. Seemed wasteful not to. He opened it. He looked at the cover for a moment. Thank you, he said. Really? You're welcome, she said. Really? He read it in 2 weeks and left it on the kitchen table one evening with 3 pages of notes he'd made in the margins, which was the highest form of praise he was capable of. Sam. The letter from Howard Briggs's contact arrived in August, 14 months after Naomi had come to Harlow on the Tuesday stage. It was not official in any legal sense. What it was a letter from a man who had been, for many years, a partner in a firm adjacent to Hessler and Marsh, who had heard through the channels that the accumulated evidence had begun to travel, and who had decided, for reasons the letter gestured toward but didn't fully explain, reasons that probably had more to do with his own conscience than with Naomi specifically, to write a formal attestation. The letter stated, clearly and with his signature and seal attached, that he had personal knowledge of Edmund Hessler's pattern of practice, that the account opened in Naomi Quinn's name had been opened without her authorization, and that the dismissal had been a deliberate act of character assassination following a failed personal arrangement. It was not a court verdict. It was, however, the kind of letter that, sent to the right places, closed doors. The Whitmore Agency's license was not reinstated. Edmund Hessler, from what Briggs could determine, was dealing with a separate financial matter that had caught the attention of people with more investigative resources than a Wyoming rancher. Something about his firm's accounts that had nothing to do with Naomi and everything to do with a pattern that eventually reached people who had the standing to pursue it. Naomi read the August letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the wooden box with the other papers. Caleb watched her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like it's over," she said. "Like I've been watching a door and it's finally closed." She looked at the box. "I didn't know how much I was still watching it until it closed. Does it feel like enough?" "No," she said. "It doesn't feel like justice, if that's what you mean. It feels like the closest you get to justice when the person who wronged you has more power than you do, which is most of the time." She paused. "But it feels like it's done, and I'm done with it." He reached across and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. That was the other thing that had happened over the 14 months, in the way that things happen between people who shared a life, quietly, in accumulated small moments, without announcement. He was not a demonstrative man, and had never been. But he had learned, slowly, through a process that felt less like changing and more like becoming what he had always been capable of being without knowing it, to say the things that needed saying before they became problems, to ask how she was in the actual way, and not the rhetorical way, to put his hand over hers at the kitchen table in the evening when something had been hard. She had not made this easy for him, which was one of the things he respected most about her. She did not accept half measures or hints in the direction of communication. When he was being closed or distant, she said so, directly, which he had initially found difficult and had come to rely on. Honesty is a practice, not just a value. Honesty is something you did every day, imperfectly, and kept trying to do better. They were not a smooth couple. They argued, not often, but when they did it was real. Two people with strong instincts and considered opinions who did not automatically defer. The first serious argument had been over the cattle prices. In February, when Naomi thought Caleb was accepting too low a rate from a buyer, and Caleb thought she didn't understand the relationship dynamics involved, and they had both been partly right and partly wrong, and the resolution had taken 2 days and involved both of them sitting down with Roy and arriving at something none of them had thought of initially, which was probably the better outcome anyway. The argument had been uncomfortable. The resolution had left them with something they wouldn't have reached without the disagreement. That was how it went. Two people, imperfect, building something imperfect that was worth building. In the fall, October again, a year after the wrong bride had stepped off the stage at Harlow Depot, Lily asked her father something at breakfast. "Do you remember the day she came?" she said, with the particular casualness of a child who has been waiting for the right moment to ask something she has been thinking about for a while. Caleb looked up from his coffee. Naomi was at the stove and went still for a moment, listening without turning around. "I remember," Caleb said. "You were going to send her back." "I was. Why didn't you?" He thought about it. Lily was 9 now, old enough for a real answer. Because I watched her take care of you, he said, and I knew, when I watched it, that I was looking at someone who was real. He paused. I knew, and I almost talked myself out of it anyway. That was my mistake. Lily absorbed this. But you didn't. Not that first time. He looked at his coffee. I was harder to convince the second time. Naomi turned from the stove then, and she and Caleb looked at each other across the kitchen in the October morning light, and in that look was everything the past year had contained. The bad afternoon, and the morning on the porch, and the fence post, and the letters, and the arguments, and the garden, and Ben's birthday, and Lily's birthday, and the wooden box, and all the ordinary days between, and the extraordinary ones. You got there, Naomi said, not as an absolution, as a fact. Eventually, he said. Eventually counts, she said, and turned back to the stove. Ben, who had come downstairs at some point in this exchange and had been eating with the apparent obliviousness of a 12-year-old, said, The waterline is frozen again. The moment shifted back to the practical business of a ranch in October. I'll look at it, Caleb said. I already looked at it, Ben said. It's the same section as February. I know how to fix it. I just need another pair of hands. Caleb looked at his son. After breakfast, he said. After breakfast, Ben agreed. Lily was watching all of this with the expression she wore when she was storing things for later consideration. She looked at Naomi's back at the stove, and then at her father, and then at her brother, and then at her breakfast. I think we turned out okay, she announced to no one in particular. Nobody argued with her. Nchetan. There was a thing Caleb understood now that he had not understood at the start of any of this. Not when he was standing on the platform at Harlow Depot in his good coat and his waxed boots. Not when the wrong woman stepped off the stage. Not during the 30 days, not even during the bad afternoon when everything broke and he stood in his kitchen and let it. He understood it now in the way you understood things that had been demonstrated to you by your own life. Not as an idea, but as a fact you had lived. The thing was this, that starting over was not the same as replacing what was lost. He had been afraid for 14 months after Clara died that any new thing would be an erasure, that letting someone new into the house, into the children's lives, into his life, would be a way of saying the old thing didn't matter. That grief had a loyalty clause and he was obligated to it indefinitely. But that was not how it worked. Clara was in the walls of the house the way she would always be in the walls of the house. She was in Ben's eyes, and in Lily's stubbornness, and in the chair by the window, and in the way both children knew, without being told, that certain things were worth being careful about. She did not disappear because Naomi came. She simply became what she was, the person who had shaped this family's first chapter, present in everything that had grown from it. And Naomi was something else entirely, not a replacement, not a second draft, something that could only exist as exactly what it was. A woman who had come from hard circumstances to a strange place and had decided, with clear eyes, that this was worth choosing. Who had been honest when honesty cost her, and patient when patience was the only tool available, and direct when directness was what was needed. Who had sat in a barn with a grieving boy and told him the truth about grief, and fixed a child's knee without making it a performance, and reorganized a pantry so that the salt was where it made sense. Who had looked at a man who had sent her away on a terrible afternoon and said yes on a porch in November, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had looked at the full picture and decided it was worth the risk. That was the thing about Naomi Quinn that Caleb could not have planned for and had not earned and had been given anyway. She had decided with full information that he was worth the risk. Not the version of him he presented when things were going well. The full version. The one who got scared and called it caution. The one who made decisions from closed-off places. The one who needed to be told to finish his sentences out loud. That version. She had looked at that version and said yes. He did not take that lightly. He tried, every day, to be worth it. Not in some performed way, not in the way of a man trying to repay a debt, but in the daily practice of being present and honest and willing to be wrong and willing to say so. He failed at this sometimes. He said so when he did. That was the whole of it. It turned out the whole of it was enough. It turned out the whole of it was, in fact, what it looked like when a family worked. Years later, not many, but enough, Ben would leave for a trade school in the county seat to study mechanical engineering, which surprised no one who had watched him with a pump and a set of tools at 10 years old. He came back for harvests and holidays, and sometimes for no reason at all, which was the best kind of coming back. He grew into the particular kind of man that a hard early life and good examples produced. Direct, patient with things that needed patience, impatient with things that were wasting time, capable of saying hard things without cruelty and soft things without embarrassment. Lily grew into herself with the thorough commitment she had always brought to everything and became, depending on who you asked, either the most organized person in the county or the most particular. She had strong opinions about most things and expressed them clearly, and she would tell you, if you asked about her childhood, that she had been raised by two people who did not always agree but always, eventually, figured it out, which she considered a better education than most. The ranch did not become prosperous in the way that word usually meant. What it became was solvent and steady, and a place where the work was real and the rewards were proportional, and the people who lived there were not living provisionally. They were living. When people in Harlow, in those later years, talked about the Ashford place, and people did because small towns maintained their histories, they sometimes mentioned the mail-order bride situation. The wrong woman, some of them said. The mix-up with the agency. But the people who had been around long enough, who had been in Garvey's dry goods that Saturday morning, who had watched the family come through what it had come through, did not say it quite that way. What they said, if they said anything, was, "He got lucky." He almost didn't know it and nearly threw it away, but he got lucky. And what Caleb himself would have said, if anyone had asked him directly, was something he had thought about enough to have words for now. That luck was real, but it required you to recognize it. That the luck was not that Naomi stepped off the stage instead of someone else. The luck was that she was honest, and he had enough left in him to see it, and that he had a son who asked the right question at the right moment, and a daughter who had always known how things should be. The luck was that all of it happened in the right order, and that he had, finally, after a bad afternoon and a night he never wanted to repeat, been willing to be the man his own life was asking him to be. Naomi, for her part, would not have called it luck. She would have called it a choice, made once on a stage in October with no guarantee of outcome, and made again every day after that in the small and large ways that choices continued to be made when you had decided something was worth deciding. That was the difference between them, and probably always would be. He saw luck, she saw choice. And the difference had never been a problem, because it turned out you could hold both things at once, and the holding of both was probably closer to the truth than either one alone. The stagecoach at Harlow still ran on Tuesdays. The depot had a new roof by the time Ben was 15. The bench where Caleb had stood in his good coat had been replaced with something sturdier, because the original had finally given out. But every Tuesday when the coach came in, Lily claimed in later years that her father would glance toward the sound of it without quite meaning to. Not with longing, not with loss. Just the reflex of a man whose life had changed direction on a Tuesday in October, and who had not entirely stopped being grateful for the wrong thing that turned out, by every measure that mattered, to be exactly right.